Timeless Assassin by author Raj_Shah_7152. Chapter 996 to 1025. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And those who want to support me, I have a Patreon channel. Get early access to video on Patreon. Chapter 996, The Constant Pursuit of Strength. Planet Ixtal, temporary Skyshard Mansion, Leo's POV. Leo sat quietly beneath the shaded terrace of the Skyside Mansion, his gaze fixed on the training courtyard where his elder son Caleb stood with a wooden practice dagger clutched tightly in small, determined hands. Across from him, an instructor corrected his stance with patient precision, guiding him through the foundational principles of thrusting, blocking, and jabbing while emphasizing the importance of balanced footwork and controlled breathing. Caleb was soon going to turn 6, and it was cult tradition that children initiate onto the path of a warrior before joining school, and hence, Amanda had hired a private instructor to get Caleb on par with his peers. Slash, jab, thrust. The movements were simple, almost too easy for Caleb to replicate, and yet they were not perfect, as Leo could instantly see the dozens of micro mistakes the kid made while copying his instructor. The arc is not correct. The intensity is wrong. Your shoulder hitches when you pull it back, Leo thought, as he winced in agony as Caleb lunged forward, the kid's footing slipping mid-thrust, as his balance faltered, forcing the instructor to gently reposition his balance so as to keep him from stumbling and crashing onto the stone. Leo watched in silence. There was something grounding about this sight, something almost surreal in its stability. He had now been home for nearly 3 months since the war at the pit had ended, and in those 3 months he had spent more time with his family than he had in the previous decade combined. He had eaten meals at the same table. He had slept under the same roof for consecutive weeks. He had even listened to the day-to-day undertakings of his kids, which were utterly pointless and still interesting. And he did not dislike it. In fact, he appreciated it more than he expected. Running the cult, shaping policy, guiding expansion, watching his children grow under safer skies than he ever knew in his youth, it all carried a quiet satisfaction. And yet, something felt incomplete. He did not quite know how to articulate it, but the stillness unsettled him in subtle ways. When he was not chasing improvement, not testing the limits of his body and mind, not standing on the edge of breakthrough, he felt as though he were drifting slightly away from the path that had defined him. Greatness had never been handed to him through comfort but rather always carved through friction, and hence when he was not improving, he felt oddly stagnant. Thrust. Shuffle. His gaze returned to Caleb, who attempted another thrust, this time landing it more cleanly. He's going to have a much better foundation than I ever did, Leo thought, as he realized that his children were beginning their journey as a warrior far earlier than he ever had. For at Caleb's age, Leo had not known what it meant to hold a weapon, let alone train with one. Back then he had been nothing more than an earth-born child with beat-down video game consoles in his hands and no comprehension of the universe's cruelty. While now, he ruled planets, negotiated with ancient beings and shaped the political order of galaxies. Every single piece of that ascent had been built upon personal strength. Not alliances. Not politics. Strength. So he understood better than anyone that should that foundation ever weaken, everything he had constructed could crumble. Overnight. I need to master the technique the Timeless Assassin told me about when we met. The manual even he could not comprehend on his road to becoming a demigod. For only by mastering it will I have the most perfect foundation for a breakthrough, Leo thought, as he recalled his conversation with the Timeless Assassin where he had been introduced to a technique that was allegedly more difficult to master than the Sevenfold Revelation Codex, and more frustrating than the Emperor's Suppression Manual. Clench. Leo's jaw tightened slightly. The Timeless Assassin had mentioned that not even he could master that technique back then, and hence Leo wondered if attempting such a risk was even wise. And yet, he couldn't help but feel as though stagnation was a greater risk than failing to comprehend something impossible. Stumble. Wobble. Caleb stumbled again, losing balance mid-jab before catching himself. His face flushed with frustration. Leo recognized that expression instantly. The refusal to accept mediocrity. The irritation at one's own limitations. As he realized that he simply wasn't wired for mediocrity, as though something in his very blood resisted it with all its force. Screech. He rose slowly from his seat. His expression stern, and his decision made, as although he recognized the value behind stability, he also knew himself well enough to understand that without pursuing the next frontier of strength, he would slowly become a lesser version of who he was meant to be. Amanda will not be too thrilled about me leaving for another expedition, but I have to go, Leo thought, as he knew very well that leaving again, even briefly, would reopen old arguments and quiet disappointments. But some paths demanded solitude. Some growth required isolation. The half-written manual still existed, hidden at the remote coordinates the timeless assassin had once entrusted to him. A fragment of something unfinished. A challenge that bordered on madness. And it was only by mastering it that he could stand above all demigods at the same tier, and perhaps gain the strength necessary to challenge even gods, as only then could he keep the cult truly safe from all enemies. It's a path I must take, no matter what, Leo thought, as he turned away from the courtyard, Caleb's determined voice echoing faintly behind him, as he firmly made up his mind about the path he would take. Within the coming week, he would leave Ixtal. He would retrieve the manual. And he would begin preparing himself for the next stage of ascension. Because without the strength to protect everything he was building, it would always be nothing more than a sand castle. Chapter 996 The Constant Pursuit of Strength. Planet Ixtal, temporary Skyshard Mansion, Leo's POV. Leo sat quietly beneath the shaded terrace of the Skyside Mansion, his gaze fixed on the training courtyard where his elder son Caleb stood with a wooden practice dagger clutched tightly in small, determined hands. Across from him, an instructor corrected his stance with patient precision, guiding him through the foundational principles of thrusting, blocking, and jabbing while emphasizing the importance of balanced footwork and controlled breathing. Caleb was soon going to turn 6, and it was cult tradition that children initiate onto the path of a warrior before joining school, and hence, Amanda had hired a private instructor to get Caleb on par with his peers. Slash, jab, thrust. The movements were simple, almost too easy for Caleb to replicate, and yet they were not perfect, as Leo could instantly see the dozens of micro-mistakes the kid made while copying his instructor. The arc is not correct. The intensity is wrong. Your shoulder hitches when you pull it back, Leo thought, as he winced in agony as Caleb lunged forward, the kid's footing slipping mid-thrust, as his balance faltered, forcing the instructor to gently reposition his balance so as to keep him from stumbling and crashing onto the stone. Leo watched in silence. There was something grounding about this sight, something almost surreal in its stability. He had now been home for nearly 3 months since the war at the pit had ended, and in those 3 months he had spent more time with his family than he had in the previous decade combined. He had eaten meals at the same table. He had slept under the same roof for consecutive weeks. He had even listened to the day-to-day undertakings of his kids, which were utterly pointless and still interesting. And he did not dislike it. In fact, he appreciated it more than he expected. Running the cult, shaping policy, guiding expansion, watching his children grow under safer skies than he ever knew in his youth, it all carried a quiet satisfaction. And yet, something felt incomplete. He did not quite know how to articulate it, but the stillness unsettled him in subtle ways. When he was not chasing improvement, not testing the limits of his body and mind, not standing on the edge of breakthrough, he felt as though he were drifting slightly away from the path that had defined him. Greatness had never been handed to him through comfort but rather always carved through friction, and hence when he was not improving, he felt oddly stagnant. Thrust. Shuffle. His gaze returned to Caleb, who attempted another thrust, this time landing it more cleanly. He's going to have a much better foundation than I ever did, Leo thought, as he realized that his children were beginning their journey as a warrior far earlier than he ever had. For at Caleb's age, Leo had not known what it meant to hold a weapon, let alone train with one. Back then he had been nothing more than an earth-born child with beat-down video game consoles in his hands and no comprehension of the universe's cruelty. While now, he ruled planets, negotiated with ancient beings and shaped the political order of galaxies. Every single piece of that ascent had been built upon personal strength. Not alliances. Not politics. Strength. So he understood better than anyone that should that foundation ever weaken, everything he had constructed could crumble overnight. I need to master the technique the timeless assassin told me about when we met. The manual even he could not comprehend on his road to becoming a demigod. For only by mastering it will I have the most perfect foundation for a breakthrough, Leo thought, as he recalled his conversation with the timeless assassin where he had been introduced to a technique that was allegedly more difficult to master than the Sevenfold Revelation Codex, and more frustrating than the Emperor's Suppression Manual. Clench. Leo's jaw tightened slightly. The timeless assassin had mentioned that not even he could master that technique back then, and hence Leo wondered if attempting such a risk was even wise. And yet, he couldn't help but feel as though stagnation was a greater risk than failing to comprehend something impossible. Stumble. Wobble. Caleb stumbled again, losing balance mid-jab before catching himself. His face flushed with frustration. Leo recognized that expression instantly. The refusal to accept mediocrity. The irritation at one's own limitations. as he realized that he simply wasn't wired for mediocrity, as though something in his very blood resisted it with all its force. Screech. He rose slowly from his seat, his expression stern, and his decision made, as although he recognized the value behind stability, he also knew himself well enough to understand that without pursuing the next frontier of strength, he would slowly become a lesser version of who he was meant to be. Amanda will not be too thrilled about me leaving for another expedition, but I have to go. Leo thought, as he knew very well that leaving again, even briefly, would reopen old arguments and quiet disappointments. But some paths demanded solitude. Some growth required isolation. The half-written manual still existed, hidden at the remote coordinates the timeless assassin had once entrusted to him. A fragment of something unfinished. A challenge that bordered on madness. And it was only by mastering it that he could stand above all demigods at the same tier, and perhaps gain the strength necessary to challenge even gods, as only then could he keep the cult truly safe from all enemies. It's a path I must take, no matter what, Leo thought, as he turned away from the courtyard, Caleb's determined voice echoing faintly behind him, as he firmly made up his mind about the path he would take. Within the coming week, he would leave Ixtal. He would retrieve the manual. And he would begin preparing himself for the next stage of ascension. Because without the strength to protect everything he was building, it would always be nothing more than a sand castle. Chapter 997 Caleth's Revenge Plan. Meanwhile, the Eternal Garden, Caleth's POV. Now that his self-imposed 90-day mourning period had finally come to an end, Caleth stood before the tombstones of Soren and Raymond, reflecting on how profoundly the universal order had shifted over the past 3 months and how those changes would reshape the ambitions he intended to pursue in the years ahead. Revenge against the cult remained at the forefront of his mind, yet he no longer viewed it through the lens of raw emotion, but rather through cold calculation, carefully weighing whether it could be executed in a manner that was decisive and controlled rather than reckless or impulsive. The universal government had crumbled, and with its fall the once cohesive universal army had fractured beyond recognition, leaving behind under his nominal authority not a disciplined war machine, but a scattered and diluted force stripped of its former unity. A few billion troops still acknowledged his command in principle, yet they were dispersed across splintered jurisdictions, tied to him more by institutional inertia than genuine allegiance, and deprived of the logistical infrastructure that had once transformed them into an overwhelming presence. Caleth understood better than anyone that a legion divided was no legion at all, and for that reason, even the forces that nominally remained under his command were not ones that he considered to be particularly dependable. Sigh. Caleth exhaled slowly, the measured breath carrying neither grief nor frustration, but the quiet acceptance of a strategist reassessing the board before making his next move, as he realized that without the machinery of unified governance, he had no blunt instrument to wield against the cult. He could not order his forces to recapture cult planets. Nor could he block their trade routes or harass their fleets while they traveled through the universe. Hell, he could not even isolate the cult diplomatically anymore, as such was the loss of his influence in universal governance. The old levers of pressure were gone, and what remained was raw influence, which was far more volatile and far less predictable. I own less and less pieces by the day, Caleth assessed, as he thought about how Clarence and Terence had defected as well, as after the fall of the universal government, the duo had chosen to swear allegiance to Morris rather than him. Clench. Caleth's jaw tightened as his thoughts shifted toward the cult next. In recent months, rumors had spread swiftly through trade networks and political corridors alike, suggesting that the Dragon King Multheric now stood behind Leo Skyshard and the cult in more ways than mere convenience. As what had begun as whispers among merchant guilds, seemed to now have matured into a widely accepted assumption that any strike against the cult would be interpreted as an indirect challenge to the Dragon Dominion itself, as the implication was clear and deliberate. That even if Multheric did not intervene immediately, the Dragon King would avenge them in time. As it was that possibility alone, that introduced hesitation among several great clans who might otherwise have tested the cult's rising strength. However, what unsettled Caleth was not the rumor itself, but the speed with which it had hardened into belief. Assumptions, once repeated often enough in the right circles, became strategic realities, and as of today, it seemed enough people believed in the Dragon Cult Alliance to make it a reality. Damn it. If there's one being I do not wish to face alone, it's that damn old dragon, Caleth muttered, as he thought about how he had no intention of fighting against Multheric alone at this stage. The Dragon King had returned with momentum and clarity, expanding his dominion with deliberate precision rather than reckless aggression. And Caleth understood that engaging him prematurely would most definitely prove counterproductive. Click. Clicking his tongue, he hence shifted his gaze from the tombstones toward the distant horizon of the garden, where filtered light fell softly through ancient trees, serene in contrast to the turbulence. Beyond, Caliph knew he could not move against Leo Skyshard and the cult without accounting for that dragon variable first. And that constraint irritated him more than open opposition ever could. It seems I have little choice, he murmured quietly. In the ever-shifting game of universal politics, revenge required infrastructure. If he intended to crush the cult and make Leo answer for what had transpired, he first needed a foundation strong enough to absorb retaliation. A single backer would suffice. One great clan, one god, one power willing to stand publicly beside him, whether out of shared interest or calculated opportunism. As with even one aligned force, the equation would change. While without one, he risked isolation. Clench. Caliph's expression hardened as he reached his conclusion. Morris. I need to reach out to Morris. He muttered, as even though unpredictable, Morris currently was the strongest ally to have in the game of universal politics, with Clarence and Terence under his fold. If only that devil temporarily decides to ally with me while I destroy the cult, it would be enough. Caliph thought, as he let the mourning period settle fully behind him. One way or another, he did intend to destroy the cult as soon as he could. However, he was not reckless enough to do it without calculating the costs attached. For now, if the rumors about the Dragon Alliance was true, then he did not want to draw Multhorax's ire without having any ally to fall back on. However, once he secured the aid of even a single ally, he swore to fly out to Ixtal and destroy it at once. As he swore to capture Leo Skyshard and his entire family, and torture them for centuries on end for the crime of killing his son. Raymond so cruelly back on the pit. Count your days, Skyshard. You have taken from me something I treasured a lot, and very soon, I will be standing over the ruins of everything you have built, so that you finally understand the cost of crossing me. Chapter 998 An Unexpected Visit. Rue Clan Territory, the Sky Fortress of Vasa, Morris's POV. Morris arrived without escort, and that, more than anything else, was what unsettled Rue Vasa. The announcement of his presence had come scarcely an hour prior to his physical arrival, carried through formal channels yet devoid of explanation, as though he had merely decided that today was the day he would pay her a visit. And so he stood at the gates of her floating citadel, storms gathering along the horizon as the deceiver tilted his head slightly, studying the architecture of her ancient residence as though it were something that fascinated him greatly. Lord Morris. Rue Vasa greeted smoothly as he entered the throne chamber alone, her tone controlled and impeccably courteous. To what do I owe the honor of a personal visit on such short notice? Her words were warm, however, her posture was not, as between them lay more than just polished marble flooring. Shine. Sparkle. Invisible wards shimmered faintly in layered arcs across the space separating them, subtle distortions in the air marking containment fields, spatial anchors, and displacement buffers carefully woven into the architecture itself, as it seemed like Rue Vasa was taking no chances when it came to personal safety. Movement dampeners. How interesting, Morris thought, as he noticed all of it instantly. A lattice of delayed approach barriers that would prevent him from crossing the chamber in a single step. It wasn't enough to defeat him, however, it was enough for Rue Vasa to open a dimensional portal and escape. Smart girl, Morris thought as he smiled, as he walked forward casually, each step unhurried, as the wards adjusted in response to his movement, glowing faintly before settling again. Your precaution wounds me, Morris replied lightly, his voice pleasant and almost amused. Must our relationship always begin with suspicion? Rue Vasa's lips curved politely. When one entertains the deceiver personally, prudence is not suspicion, she replied, as her eyes flicked briefly to the spatial distortion between them. It is survival. Morris chuckled softly at that, appreciating the honesty. He did not attempt to breach the wards, nor did he test the barriers. He simply stopped at the exact distance where the innermost layer began, folding his hands loosely behind his back as lightning flickered faintly beyond the high-arched windows of the fortress. Kaboom! You can relax, Vasa, I have not come to declare war on you today, he said calmly. Nor have I come to claim your territory. A pause. What I have come for, is to discuss an opportunity. Rue Vasa did not relax. But she did listen. The deceiver's visits were never random. And if he had chosen to come personally rather than send a proxy, then the matter at hand was either extraordinarily delicate or extraordinarily dangerous. She inclined her head slightly. Very well, go on, I am listening. Morris's smile deepened just enough to suggest that the game had begun. Tell me, Rue Vasa, he said conversationally, as though discussing whether rather than the future of gods. How satisfied are you, with the current balance of power? The wards between them hummed softly. And for the first time since he entered, Rue Vasa felt the weight of possibility settle heavier than the threat of immediate violence. Morris had not come to kill her. He had come to move the board. And that was far more unsettling. Allying with the great clans has brought you nothing but mediocrity. For the past 2,250 years. And to be honest, it pains me to see a woman as talented as you rely on those pigs-like men you call allies. I mean, what the hell are those guys even doing, letting the dragon Multheric push them around like that? In just 3 months they have already lost 5 planets to him, and 2 to the cult. And within the next century I only foresee more decline for the great clans. Morris began, as he used his glib tongue to try and influence Vasa's mind. It was the universal government before that. And the cult of ascension before that. But the question is, when have the great clans ever dominated universal politics? I mean, yes, you guys do control vast amounts of territories. However, when has it ever translated to true dominance? The deceiver baited, as he tried to imply that the alliance of the great clans had been a mistake from the start. As long as Multheric exists, the great clan alliance is never going to be the true overlords of the universe, and without an origin metal blade in your arsenal, you are never going to be able to kill that old bastard. However, what if I, Morris, were to say, I'm ready to lend you my services and my origin metal blade to kill Multheric? Tell me, Vasa, how would you feel about that? Morris asked, as Rue Vasa could not help but feel her eyes widen at the proposition. What's the catch? She asked immediately, as she understood that if something sounded too good to be true, it probably was, which was why she wanted to understand the caveat behind this proposition before weighing its benefits. The catch is that I don't see the point behind having so many great clans in the universe. I say, you, me, Mushen and Yukiro. The 4 of us can divide the universe amongst ourselves. While Kalith, Multheric, Luhan and Dutrask can all rot in hell. Ha 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 ha. Morris suggested, as Rue Vasa immediately saw through his glib tongue and realized that Morris was trying to employ the old divide and rule strategy, where he broke old alliances and pitted old allies against one another to sow maximum chaos. However, while she did see through his strategy to potentially pit allies against one another, what she failed to sense was his deeper technique at play, whereby he was carefully dismantling the wards between himself and Vasa, while her attention was fully drawn to his words rather than actions. Chapter 999 Close but no candy. Rue Clan Territory, the Sky Fortress of Vasa, Morris's POV. Rue Vasa did not immediately respond to Morris's outrageous proposal, though the faint narrowing of her eyes made it clear she was not the least bit interested in biting on the line that the deceiver had thrown her. You are bold, she said at last, her tone level and almost amused, though the air between them remained thick with restrained power. You propose that I betray centuries of alliance, dismantle the great clan equilibrium, and trust the most notorious deceiver in recorded history, all because you suddenly feel generous. Morris smiled faintly, as though the question itself pleased him. Generous, he echoed lightly, taking another slow step forward, the innermost barrier adjusting with a brief flicker before stabilizing. No, Vasa, I am practical. I see stagnation where you see tradition, and I see failures where you see allies. The great clan alliance is in my genuine opinion a shackle on intelligent gods such as yourself. And with history as my witness, I swear upon everything good and holy, that you would be better off without it. Morris said, as the faint hum of a spatial anchor pulsed once, then recalibrated. Rue Vasa noticed the pulse, yet she did not yet notice the delay, as her attention remained locked on Morris and his words alone. You speak of stagnation, she replied calmly, folding her hands loosely before her, though several contingency runes flared invisibly beneath the marble floor. Yet you stand alone, Morris. The great clans may not dominate the universe outright, but they endure. We survived the era of the timeless assassin together. We survived the rule of the universal government together. And we know for a fact, that we will outlast the dragon Multheric too. The great clan alliance might not be dominant, but it has a reliable structure, and I have faith in it. Morris chuckled softly, tilting his head as another displacement buffer shimmered and corrected a fraction too slowly. Structure is simply slow-moving decay, he said conversationally. Multheric has already demonstrated that your structure bends under pressure. 5 planets in 3 months. 2 more to the cult. And you still speak of endurance. Rue Vasa's jaw tightened slightly. Multheric is an anomaly, she said coolly. And anomalies are temporary. Is he? Morris asked, stepping closer again, the outermost ward thinning like mist under unseen strain. Or is he the new axis around which this era will rotate? A faint crack ran through one containment lattice. It sounded like nothing. It felt like nothing. Rue Vasa's gaze remained fixed on Morris's face, watching for intent rather than movement. And what are you in this rotation? She asked smoothly. A savior? Or merely another predator circling the same prize? Morris's smile widened just enough to suggest both answers were correct. I am offering you inevitability, he said softly. With my blade and your influence, all our common enemies fall. And once they fall, the universe reorganizes under fewer banners. He took one more step, and this time, the inner lattice did not hum, it flickered, as Ruvasa finally noticed the issue. Huh, she wondered, as her eyes sharpened instantly, and her heart skipped a beat. That delay, it was too long, she realized, as she finally noticed the faint stream of near-invisible divine essence that Morris had been manipulating for the past few minutes, using which he had successfully overloaded the protection charms. Morris, she said slowly, her aura rising by a fraction. What is the meaning behind this? She asked. However, Morris did not answer through words but rather vanished. Voosh. He moved like a silent distortion that folded the remaining distance between them like paper, as he slipped through the microscopic fractures he had spent the entire conversation engineering. Ruvasa reacted instantly. A fourth-dimensional portal tore open behind her in a spiraling fracture of light as her body began phasing upward into higher spatial strata. You arrogant. The Grudgekeeper blade cut through the air without glow, without roar, without warning, as he aimed to decapitate her head from her body. However, Ruvasa twisted at the last possible fraction of motion, her body already dissolving into higher geometry as the blade completed its arc. Slash. Instead of total decapitation, the blade's edge kissed flesh, as a sharp, searing line carved across the back of her neck, the edge biting deep enough to draw divine blood, yet not deep enough to complete the kill. Splat. Sizzle. The wound hissed. Reality rippled violently. Ruvasa vanished fully into the fourth dimension with a distorted shockwave that rattled the chamber's pillars, her escape incomplete but successful. Silence fell. Morris stood alone within the ruined lattice of wards, the last containment rune sputtering into nothing. He glanced down at the thin smear of divine blood along the origin metal blade and exhaled softly. Ooh la 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 la, so close and yet no candy. I wonder how the timeless assassin used to do it. Gods have such unbelievable reflexes. I thought I had her pinned for sure. But she still managed to somehow escape. Ha 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 ha. This is so unexpected. I thought I'd get her for sure. But now that she's escaped, I can't help but wonder how she will react to me trying to kill her. Ha 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 ha. Morris chuckled, as the very thought of the unpredictable chaos that could follow his attempt to kill Vasa made him feel exhilarated. Slurp. He licked the blood from the blade with a delightful expression on his face, as he enjoyed the thick and divine essence-rich texture of the liquid. Delicious, he muttered, as he turned toward the fractured horizon beyond the fortress windows, and calculated the ripple effect that was sure to follow his attempt at taking Vasa's life. I may have failed, but I feel like sometimes a failed assassination can be more destabilizing than a successful one. He muttered, as with a delighted expression on his face, he opened a fourth-dimensional portal himself, as he returned to Granada at once. Chapter 1000 Declaration of War. The Fourth Dimension, Ruvasa's POV. The fourth dimension did not tolerate instability, and as Ruvasa forced her way through its volatile geometry with an origin metal wound burning at the base of her neck, the higher strata twisted violently around her faltering form as though the dimension itself sensed weakness and moved to exploit it. Her vision fractured into overlapping layers of distorted reality, colors stretching into impossible spectrums while spatial currents dragged at her limbs in uneven pulses, threatening to pull her off course as the wound throbbed with a malevolent persistence that refused to be ignored. This was not ordinary pain, nor the blunt trauma of divine combat that could be shrugged off with sufficient authority, but rather a corrosive agony that resisted time itself, because origin metal did not merely cut flesh, it rejected divine regeneration at its core and interfered with a god's natural dominion over their own body. Throb. Sputter. The gash across the back of her neck felt like a shard of frozen lightning embedded against her spine, each pulse of her aura scraping against the foreign metal and igniting fresh waves of searing torment, while her blood, dense with divine essence, refused to clot properly under its suppressive influence. She pressed her palm firmly against the wound, sealing the flow through sheer force of will, yet even her divine control trembled as the corruption spread outward in faint, burning threads that numbed and inflamed simultaneously. Every shift through dimensional folds sent jagged spikes of heat racing up her skull and down her spine, threatening to splinter her concentration at the worst possible moment, while the warped geometry around her shimmered like an endless labyrinth of spiraling light. Focus. She commanded herself fiercely, anchoring her consciousness against the distortion as the memory replayed in brutal clarity. Morris had not merely attacked her. He had aimed to decapitate her. The precision of the strike haunted her, and the realization that she had escaped by less than a fraction of a heartbeat sent a delayed chill through her veins that rivaled even the wound's relentless burn. He dismantled the wards, while speaking. The humiliation cut almost as deeply as the blade itself. If she faltered now, if her pathway fractured under strain, she risked being lost within the endless void between worlds, vulnerable and exposed in a state she had not known in millennia. So she forced her trajectory toward U-clan territory with strained determination, steering through unstable currents toward the one god who both understood the stakes of divine politics and could guarantee her safety while she was weakened. Yukiro, my secret lover. She muttered faintly, more to anchor herself than out of sentiment, as the journey stretched intolerably long and every second felt like a prolonged descent through burning glass. By the time the U-clan's spatial perimeter signatures brushed against her senses, her aura had thinned noticeably, its once stable presence wavering at the edges as exhaustion and pain intertwined. With a final surge of will, she tore open an exit point, and reality snapped violently back into 3 dimensions with a resonant crack. Crack. Ruvasa stumbled onto polished marble flooring inside Yukiro's private residence, her body materializing mid-stride before collapsing to one knee as the wound flared viciously and divine blood seeped between her fingers. The guards stationed around the chamber recoiled in alarm, weapons half raised before recognition dawned upon them, while Yukiro rose instantly from his seat, disbelief flashing across his composed features as he took in her pallor and the dark sheen of blood staining her hand. Vasa, what's wrong? His voice carried unmistakable alarm, a rare fracture in his otherwise measured tone. Ruvasa remained hunched, her hand clamped tightly over the back of her neck as bright crimson blood dripped between her knuckles and sizzled faintly upon the marble floor, the air around her shimmering as her aura fought desperately to stabilize. It was Morris, she forced out through clenched teeth, lifting her gaze to meet his as pain pulsed behind her eyes. The crazy bastard tried to take my life. Silence fell heavy across the chamber, and Yukiro's expression shifted from shock to something far colder and infinitely more dangerous as he stepped forward, already sensing the unmistakable residue of origin metal embedded within her wound. I knew we should not have let that madman walk away with Soren's blade, Yukiro said, his voice lowering into something dangerous as he stepped closer, carefully parting her blood-streaked fingers to inspect the wound without yet touching it. But for him to be so brazen as to strike at you personally, within your own fortress, while the Great Clan Alliance still stands, that is not provocation. That is declaration of war. The temperature within the chamber seemed to drop as his aura flared instinctively, fine cracks spidering across the marble beneath his feet before stabilizing under conscious restraint. He thinks we are too weak and spineless to retaliate, Yukiro continued, his jaw tightening as the faint scent of origin metal confirmed his suspicion. He believes we are too busy consolidating, too wary of Multheric, too cautious to retaliate decisively. So he tests the perimeter, and he tests it through you. His fists clenched, knuckles whitening as divine energy coiled around his frame in controlled surges. This is it, he said quietly, though the restraint in his tone made the statement heavier than a shout ever could. We have tolerated his chaos because it did not directly wound us. We convinced ourselves that the best way to deal with the madman was to not pay him any attention. However, our patience must have its limits. His eyes hardened as he met hers. Attacking you is not the same as taking a planet or two. It is not an opportunistic expansion. It is an assassination attempt against a clan god. And by proxy the entire Great Clan Alliance. A pause. And that, Yukiro finished coldly, most definitely means war. Chapter 1001 Search for the Manual. Meanwhile, Planet Ixtal, Leo's POV. Just like Leo expected, Amanda was not thrilled in the slightest when he informed her that he needed to leave for a few days to retrieve an item of grave importance to the cult, as she immediately reminded him of the quiet promise he had made after the war at the pit, where he had reassured her that he would try, truly try, to be present as a husband and father rather than vanish whenever ambition called. You said things would be different, she told him, her voice calm but edged with the kind of restraint that hurt more than anger, as she stood across from him in the study with folded arms and searching eyes. Things are different, Leo replied evenly, not defensive but pragmatic, as he met her gaze without flinching. I have been here. I have eaten with you. Trained Caleb. Helped with policy instead of disappearing into war. I am still being a family man. This is a short work trip, unavoidable under the present circumstances, and I will return in a couple days. Amanda studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the last 3 months of consistency he had shown, and though reluctance lingered in her expression, she eventually exhaled and nodded faintly, conceding not because she was fully convinced, but because a couple of days did not seem like a betrayal of the stability they had rebuilt. Come back soon, okay? She said quietly. I will, Leo answered, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. According to the coordinates left behind by the timeless assassin, the incomplete manual was hidden on a unique tidally locked planet. Designated in ancient records as Planet V*, a desolate geo-world bound eternally to its parent sun, such that one hemisphere remained in perpetual daylight and blistering heat while the other lay frozen in endless night. There was no axial rotation. Only slow revolution. One side of V* was a furnace of molten stone and superheated winds that scraped across blackened crust like liquid fire, while the opposite side was an abyss of crystalline ice plains where temperatures plunged so low that even trace gases crystallized upon contact with the surface. Between these two extremes existed a narrow twilight strip, a thin ring encircling the planet where the sun forever lingered at the horizon, and where temperatures, though harsh, were survivable for a limited time. As it was within this fragile equilibrium zone that the coordinates converged. I wonder why he chose to leave the manual on such a planet of all places. Leo wondered, as there was no atmosphere on V* to speak of. There was no breathable oxygen, no protective magnetic field shielding the surface from solar radiation. As for ordinary life, V* was an impossibility, while even for a monarch like him, it was a training field constantly testing his limits rather than a comfortable training space. FSHHHHH. A fourth-dimensional fracture tore open above the twilight strip as Leo stepped through calmly, emerging onto cracked basalt ground beneath with a calm thud. Ears pop. The absence of air was immediate. Silence absolute. He did not inhale. Instead, he sealed his lungs and circulated mana internally, while a dense layer of protective aura coated his skin, reinforcing him against pressure fluctuations and micro-particle abrasion drifting across the surface. The ground radiated residual heat from the sunward side, while behind him, barely a few kilometers away, frost crept across jagged terrain like an advancing tide of death. He could feel the environmental hostility pressing against his aura, testing it. His current limit allowed him roughly 2 hours without oxygen, perhaps slightly longer if he minimized unnecessary exertion, though prolonged exploration would require either a spacecraft or specialized survival equipment. This place would kill anything below Monarch tier in seconds, Leo muttered softly, observing how even standing upright here required continuous mana regulation. The terrain ahead was uneven and fractured, ridges of volcanic stone rising sharply before descending into narrow ravines that glowed faintly from thermal gradients between the hot and cold hemispheres, while distant rock formations cast elongated shadows under the eternal twilight. Somewhere on this narrow habitable band lay the ruins left behind by the timeless assassin. Leo narrowed his eyes, extending his perception carefully across the terrain as he began walking forward, boots scraping against mineral crust in a world where no wind blew and no life stirred. I suppose you chose this place deliberately, he murmured, recalling the assassin's words about how this technique needed comprehension and a stroke of genius to complete. And perhaps of all the planets, the timeless assassin felt like this was the best place to do so. Leo felt a faint flicker of anticipation beneath his calm exterior. He had at best a couple of hours before oxygen deprivation would force him to retreat, and within that window he needed to locate the hidden structure, breach whatever protections guarded it, and secure the incomplete manuscript. Absolute vision. Leo used absolute vision to cover every square inch of the twilight strip for a 15-kilometer radius, as he ensured that there was nothing of note in the area, before using enhanced to take a single leap, as he crossed the whole area and restarted his search. Compared to his days back in the Rodova Military Academy, where he could barely cover a radius of 500 meters using the skill, he felt like he had indeed come a long way, as although he was using the same skill even at the Monarch tier, the difference in range was immeasurable. Not bad, at this pace I can cover a significant portion of the strip in the next 2 hours, he thought, as he repeated the process for the next 30 minutes, until suddenly, he came across an area with unusually high concentration of mana just a few kilometers ahead. Interesting, I wonder what it could be. Leo wondered, as he took another leap, and arrived at the mana density site at once. Chapter 1002 Finding the Manual. Planet V*, Twilight Strip, Leo's POV. Upon arriving at the high-density mana location, Leo quietly explored the surroundings for a while, before eventually realizing that the actual structure that made this area special was buried at least 20 to 30 meters below the surface, as the energy he sensed did not radiate outward like a natural anomaly, but instead converged downward in deliberate spirals that suggested containment rather than diffusion. As he extended absolute vision beneath the fractured basalt crust, the vague fluctuation resolved into something unmistakably artificial, its outline too symmetrical and too defined to be the product of geological coincidence. The cavity below appeared compact and self-contained, its borders sharply angular in contrast to the chaotic fault lines surrounding it, as though someone had carved a small chamber into the planet's spine and then wrapped it in inscriptions capable of drawing mana inward from the fragile equilibrium zone above. Sigh. Leo exhaled slowly without actually breathing, as he sealed his lungs tighter and thickened the layer of protective aura coating his skin to withstand the planet's vacuum and abrasive microparticles, while calculating that every minute spent excavating would eat into the narrow window he had before oxygen deprivation dulled his reactions. Summoning his daggers into his hands, he did not dig recklessly, but instead began slicing into the crust with precise, angled cuts, as he exploited existing stress fractures within the basalt and used controlled bursts of strength to dislodge entire slabs of rock rather than chip away inefficiently. Slash, push, dig. As each blade carved downward in rhythmic arcs, he rotated his hips and shoulders in perfect alignment, allowing momentum and technique to multiply force without wasting aura, while massive chunks of mineral crust split cleanly and were lifted aside as though gravity itself obeyed his will. Over the next half hour, as the shaft deepened and the mana density intensified around him like invisible pressure building within a sealed vessel, Leo steadily uncovered what lay beneath, until the final layer of hardened stone gave way and revealed a small hut-like structure embedded within the planet's core. The structure was compact and almost humble in shape, yet its surface was covered entirely in inscriptions that pulsed faintly with restrained power, as each marking seemed to channel and circulate the surrounding mana field in precise loops that fed back into themselves. Leo stepped closer cautiously, as he realized that the inscriptions were not written in any language he recognized, nor did they resemble known script systems tied to clans, gods, or ancient civilizations, while their geometric arrangement hinted at meaning far deeper than mere decoration. There was nothing inside the hut except those inscriptions lining every interior wall, and as he extended his senses more carefully, he understood that the overwhelming mana density saturating the area was not natural at all, but entirely a byproduct of these symbols drawing, compressing, and refining energy through some unknown mechanism. Of course, Leo murmured softly within the vacuum, as the realization settled over him that the hut itself was not a shelter, but a key, and that the inscriptions were the true artifact the timeless assassin had hidden in this impossible world. There's nothing inside this hut apart from these inscriptions, which means either the hut itself is the manual, or this place is merely the key to where the real one is hidden, Leo muttered, as he slowly crouched and ran his fingers across the carved surface, feeling the faint hum of condensed mana vibrating beneath the stone like a restrained heartbeat. To test his theory, he lifted one dagger and drew a shallow cut across his thumb, allowing a bead of blood to gather before carefully letting it drip onto the etched floor below, as though attempting to bind with the cover of a newly discovered meditation scripture. Plop, sizzle. The instant the drop touched the surface, it began to hiss and evaporate, either reacting to the near vacuum pressure of V-star or to the peculiar composition of the hut's interior, yet regardless of the cause, the reaction was immediate and violent as the entire structure shuddered like something awakened from long dormancy. Tremble. Brighten. The inscriptions lining the walls flared to life one by one, as though finally tapping into the vast reservoir of mana they had patiently cycled and stored for millennia, while the interior of the hut began to glow brighter and brighter until the space was swallowed in blinding white. "The hell?" Leo said, as he instinctively raised a layer of aura to shield his eyes while the light intensified, flooding every carved groove and crack with searing brilliance as though the structure itself were dissolving into pure energy. For several long seconds the radiance grew unbearable, as the mana currents within the chamber roared like a silent storm, before the glow abruptly stabilized and then slowly began to dim, retreating from overwhelming brilliance into a focused point at the center of the hut. As the light condensed, it shaped itself into a translucent projection of a man standing before Leo, his form flickering slightly yet undeniably distinct, with a long beard flowing to his chest, a curled mustache framing sharp lips, and piercing gray eyes that held the kind of predatory calm Leo knew all too well. He recognized the face instantly. The timeless assassin. And yet, not quite. Gone was the clean-shaven youthfulness and relaxed charm Leo remembered, as it was instead replaced by a sage-like austerity that lent the man an older, sterner presence, as though this projection had been forged from a different chapter of his existence. The bearded figure squinted at Leo as though examining an unfamiliar specimen, his expression sharpening into irritation rather than recognition. "Who the hell are you?" the projection demanded bluntly, folding his arms as his gaze raked over Leo's form. "Your blood activated this mechanism, which means you are definitely from my bloodline. However, you are not me, Caliph, or Soren, are you?" he asked, as Leo stared back at him, confusion plainly etched across his features as he felt the beginnings of a monumental headache creeping in. He could already sense it. The complication. the unclear phrasing, and the inevitable layers of absurdity about to unfold, as memories of blood-boiling instructions and maddening wordplay from previous manuals resurfaced unpleasantly. Please don't tell me the manual can talk this time, Leo muttered under his breath, as he shook his head violently from side to side. If this projection was the manual itself, then judging by the sharp intelligence glittering in those gray eyes, Leo had the sinking feeling that he would be wishing he had killed himself at least 5 times a day before this was over. Chapter 1003 Disbelief in Progress. For several long seconds, Leo and the projection of the timeless assassin simply stared at one another in strained silence, their expressions mirroring a shared disbelief that bordered on contempt, as though neither could quite accept that the figure standing before him was real, let alone worthy of acknowledgement. I'll ask you again, boy, who the hell are you? And how did you find this place? The projection asked bluntly, as Leo could not help but shake his head slowly from side to side, half in disbelief and half in resignation. I am Leo Skyshard. I'm your descendant, and I am the current cult master of the Cult of Ascension, having taken it over from your son, Soren. Leo introduced himself evenly, as the projection's eyes widened in visible shock. It was clearly a sentient construct, one capable of understanding nuance and implication rather than merely reciting pre-programmed responses, which surprised Leo more than he expected, since he had never encountered such advanced projection techniques before. It was almost as though the man before him possessed a fully formed consciousness without the anchoring presence of a body or soul, which made the entire situation deeply unsettling, as Leo had never known awareness to exist independently of spiritual essence. I see, so you're the new cult master, E.H. The projection muttered while stroking his beard, his gaze sweeping over Leo with mild, undisguised disappointment. Just how weak has the Cult of Ascension become for a monarch to be leading it now? No offense, you're clearly talented for your tier, I can feel that much from your aura. However, it seems to me as though Soren has rushed your ascension. He should not have handed you the mantle while you're still this young, he said, as Leo let out a deliberately exaggerated fake sigh. Sigh. Well, he did not hand it to me. And yes, you're right, I'm not ready, Leo replied without defensiveness. However, with him dead, I'm the next best option, since I am the strongest warrior the cult currently has. He explained, as at that, the projection fell momentarily speechless. My son, dead? He asked quietly, though the tremor beneath his voice betrayed something far darker, as for a fleeting instant Leo saw past the sage-like facade and glimpsed the true face of the timeless assassin, a killer whose fury once shook the universe. The anger in his eyes was lethal, yet without a soul to anchor it, there was no tangible killing intent radiating outward, which only made the restrained intensity more unsettling. It's a long story, Leo said calmly. Your son was killed by the same man who killed you, who also happens to be your other son, Caliph. He paused briefly before continuing. And while I don't mind narrating the entire tale, I'm not interested in doing it for free. If you promise to answer my questions patiently afterward, I'll tell you everything, from the great betrayal that killed you to the great war at the pit, and how it led me here. For a while, the projection seemed stunned into silence, his mouth opening and closing without words as the weight of Leo's statement settled in, as though the revelation of Caliph's betrayal and fratricide was something he had never fully allowed himself to consider. Eventually, however, the resistance faded. I see, he said at last, as the anger in his expression dimmed into something closer to shame, and he lowered his head slightly. Yes, tell me what happened, and in return, I will do my best to accommodate your curiosity. Cult Master, the projection said, as Leo's heart skipped a beat at being referred to as Cult Master. However, he hid it well, as he simply nodded once before beginning to recount the story of the great betrayal and the chain of events that ultimately culminated in the Great War of the Pit. Meanwhile, inside the time-stilled world, Ver's POV. It had been only 60 days in the outside universe since Leo had sentenced Ver to isolation inside the time-stilled world. However, nearly 17 years had passed for him within its frozen expanse, as the accelerated flow of time forced him to endure a solitude that stripped away excuses and left only discipline and consequence. With his talents, he could have easily reached the peak of transcendent tier within the first 5 years with intense discipline. However, because of his past abuse of life essence to speed up his breakthrough, it now took him 17 to achieve the same output. However, after 17 years of relentless training, repeated failures, and slow reconstruction of his damaged foundation, Ver finally reached the threshold required to transition from the transcendent tier to monarch. Good job, Lieutenant. If you somehow manage to break through successfully, we will promote you to the rank of Commander. Commander Mickey James said as he handed Ver the breakthrough potion, completely unaware that the man behind the disguise of shapeshift was none other than the cult's dragon. However, even after receiving the potion, Ver did not rush the breakthrough, as he instead took his time, approaching the breakthrough methodically, as he first brought his body to peak condition over the next few days before finally attempting the jump. I hope I don't disappoint the expectations of my cult members and my cuz, he muttered before gulping the potion, as he attempted the breakthrough with laser focus. The transition was difficult but clean. No violent backlash, no collapse. When the surge subsided, Ver stood within the time-stilled world as a monarch. The instability that once plagued his foundation had finally been resolved, and though it had cost him 12 additional years beyond what should have been necessary, the result was undeniable. Ver was now a monarch-tier warrior, and unlike his previous ascension, this one was built upon discipline rather than desperation. However, even though he achieved a major milestone in his journey as a warrior, Ver did not stop, as without celebration or pause, he resumed training immediately, refining his control and consolidating his strength as steady momentum replaced reckless ambition. As he remained determined to ensure that the time he had sacrificed inside isolation would not be wasted when he finally returned to the outside world. Chapter 1004 The Great Conundrum. Planet V Star, inside the Enchanted Hut, Leo's POV. For a good 20 minutes, Leo narrated the story of the great betrayal and everything that followed to the timeless assassin's projection, before realizing that he was running out of breath, as he requested to be excused for a moment. "Please, excuse me for a while, I'll be right back," he said, as he opened a fourth-dimensional portal, and made a short trip back home, before returning a few minutes later, with his lungs full of air. "Yes, like I was saying," he continued without pausing, as for another half an hour, he recalled more lore that transpired, before eventually tying it all up with why he was here now, as the timeless assassin's projection finally understood the full picture. "I see, so that's how it turned out in the end," the man said, looking surprised, as he found it hard to accept that his life had turned out to be such a failure. "I never expected Caliph to kill me, or for myself to die without completing this project. Ha 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 ha. I always thought I would understand the universe's greatest conundrum before dying," the projection said, as Leo's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "What conundrum? What was the problem you were solving which you could not? What prompted you to leave this projection of yourself behind?" Leo asked, as the timeless assassin's projection paused for a while. Before answering, "It is difficult to explain this to someone who has not yet crossed into demi-godhood, because until you stand within the current of time rather than merely being carried by it, your perception of what time truly is remains incomplete. However, if I were to explain it, this is the best I can do, so try to follow the picture I'm painting," he began, as Leo listened in rapt attention. "Everything the gods have come to understand about time suggests that time is not a straight line but a closed system, a loop without origin and without termination. You can think of it as a self-sustaining continuum in which past, present, and future are not separate points but different angles of the same unbroken circle. Which is exactly why, when a being becomes a god, he does not merely move through time, he aligns with it, merges with its structure, and gains the ability to correct disturbances within the loop, which is why divine injury lacks permanence. If harm occurs at one coordinate, the flow compensates at another, restoring equilibrium as though the damage had only been a temporary fluctuation within a larger cycle. Under that model, true death for a god should be impossible, because nothing within a closed loop can fall outside its own continuity. And yet, origin metal exists. Origin metal does not obey the loop. It does not rewind, it does not correct, and it does not reconcile with adjacent moments. A wound inflicted by it remains absolute, as though the strike never entered the circle in the first place but pierced it from beyond. And for me, that implies something profoundly troubling. For origin metal to function as it does, it must originate from outside the temporal system entirely. But if time has no beginning and no end, then there should be no outside from which such a substance could emerge. So tell me, how can something exist beyond a loop that has no end? And how can a material precede time, if time has no beginning? If the loop theory is correct, the existence of origin metal should be impossible. And if origin metal is real, then the loop theory is incomplete. Which is why that contradiction between divine immortality and temporal exclusion is a conundrum. The projection explained, as Leo blinked in confusion. In theory, he understood what the projection was trying to imply, however, without having the fundamental knowledge of time, or how the universal law of time worked, he could not understand why this conundrum was so confusing, or what its implications meant for godhood. "So what exactly is it that you wish to achieve here?" Leo asked next, as the projection's face brightened at the question. "What I wish to achieve," he said slowly, his translucent frame seeming to steady with conviction, "is not merely to understand the contradiction, but to surpass it." He did not pace, yet the air around him felt as though it tightened. If origin metal proves that something can exist outside the temporal loop, then the loop is not absolute. And if it is not absolute, then it can be transcended. And if it can be transcended, then one can move beyond it. His gaze locked onto Leo. My ultimate aim is to move beyond it and become something greater than a mere god. Leo's brow furrowed. Oddhood is alignment with time. It is merging with the Ao and gaining the authority to correct disturbances within the loop. It grants resilience, yes. But it does not grant freedom. You are still inside the architecture. You are still bound by its design. He lifted his chin slightly. I wish to break the loop. I wish to step outside the system entirely. Because only by doing so can one become something greater than a god. Leo felt a subtle shift in his heartbeat. Greater than a god? He asked quietly. Yes, the projection replied without hesitation. A true divinity. Not a being that participates in time, but one that stands beyond it. If you think about it, neither fate nor karma are affected by time. They are not wounded. They are not rewound. They are not corrected. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. They persist regardless of era. Regardless of destruction. Regardless of which branch of history manifests. Which leads me to a singular hypothesis. His gray eyes narrowed. They exist outside the system. Leo's heart skipped. Outside the system. You are saying you want to become something like fate? Leo asked, carefully as the projection's lips curved faintly in response. Not an abstract force. Not a passive principle. But an existence of equal standing. An entity that shapes the flow of time without being shaped in return. Gods flow with time. Fate does not flow. Karma does not bend. They simply are. The weight of that idea pressed into the hut-like invisible gravity. Gods cannot escape the loop, the projection continued. But something outside it can define it. He leaned forward slightly. And if origin metal proves that something stands beyond time, then the system is not sealed. His eyes burned with quiet obsession. And if it is not sealed, then there must be a door. A door we can find together. Chapter 1005. Trust me, bro. And if it is not sealed, then there must be a door. A door we can find together. The timeless assassin's projection said, as Leo listened to his words in rapt attention. Becoming something greater than a god. Is that even possible? Leo wondered, as although he did not know for certain if such a door even existed, he felt his heart skip a beat at the possibility that it could be done. When I created this chamber, it was my hope that it would be either me or my sons that would find a way to move beyond the shackles of godhood. However, for you to appear before me as a mortal, it could very well be a game destiny is playing for me to try complete my incomplete work. The projection said while stroking his beard, as he thought about a new tangent of possibility. A possibility that sounded impossible to even attempt, yet if somehow completed, could prove to be absolutely universe-changing. Yes, if there was someone who could accomplish that, then maybe, just maybe, a greater path could open for them down the line. The projection muttered to himself, as he became lost in his own thoughts. Meanwhile, Leo felt a growing unease start to form in his chest, as the way the projection started to think about this next path gave him a very bad feeling in his stomach. No, no, he screamed in his head, as he knew what was about to follow next. No, I'm not a miracle worker. Nor am I your test dummy to see just how far I can go before I break. I'm a normal human. I have limits. I'm not limitless. Leo thought, as he clenched his teeth hard in desperation. If you turn to me next and approach me with some ridiculous request based on a hypothesis that you just cooked in your heart right now, then I don't care if you're just a projection, I'm throwing hands at you, motherfuck. I said it. I'm throwing hands. Leo thought, as he eased his eyelids and watched the timeless assassin's projection with extremely thin eye slits. Boy. The timeless assassin's projection began, as he turned towards Leo with the exact sort of hopeful expression that sent a chill down Leo's spine. How would you feel if I said, I'm going to teach you how to be the best painter in history? Even though you're blind, the projection asked, as Leo stifled a cough and repeated what the man was saying. You want me, a blind man, to become the best painter in history? I'm assuming it's a metaphor for some other training. However, how can a blind man paint, when painting requires you to see the brush strokes and color combinations you're using? Not to mention, you don't want me to just learn how to paint. You want to make me the best in history. Do you yourself hear how insane that sounds? Leo asked, as the projection stroked his beard without an ounce of empathy on his face. I mean, of course I understand the difficulty associated with such a task. However, I've pondered upon it and it seems like it's not entirely impossible either. So hear me out. He began, as he widened his posture and began speaking with visible excitement. You know how only after you become a demigod, you can start to perceive the laws of the universe. and can truly observe the higher dimension. The projection paused, as Leo further closed his eyelids into a thinner line. Yes, ideally, no one truly begins to understand the laws of the universe until they reach the demigod stage, because, like the blind painter analogy, you're just not capable of watching the colors until you're at least a demigod. While, only after mastering those laws does one step into godhood. That's the established order. But what if that order isn't mandatory? What if there exists a monarch with enough aura mastery to move safely through the fourth dimension, someone whose perception is already sharp enough to sense what most demigods struggle to? Then, with me guiding him, telling him exactly what to feel for, what distortions to observe, what shifts in flow actually matter, I could teach him the laws step by step. Not through theory or scripture, but rather through direct perception. And if somehow, we succeed, if that understanding forms before the breakthrough, if mastery comes first, then when such a monarch eventually does become a demigod, he would not be learning the laws. He would already command them. And a demigod who commands the laws from the very moment of ascension is not the same as the rest. He would be capable of challenging gods. And if he pushes further, if he finds a pathway beyond even that, then perhaps he does not become a god who flows within destiny. Perhaps he can become one that can defy destiny. The projection proposed, as Leo instantly understood that this was bullshit through and through. Blink. Leo stared at him for a long second. Then another. Then he slowly dragged a hand down his face. The amount of what-ifs in your plan, Leo said flatly, is making me feel like you're completely deluded on hopium. The projection blinked. This is not a concrete plan of action, Leo continued, gesturing vaguely at the air between them. This is theoretical fan fiction. He began counting on his fingers. What if a monarch can perceive the laws early? What if I don't explode? What if the loop isn't sealed? What if there's a door? What if destiny isn't absolute? What if? He dropped his hand. You're stacking hypotheticals on top of metaphysics and calling it a strategy. The projection narrowed his eyes slightly, as Leo leaned back against the wall of the hut. Let me summarize your proposal. You want me, a monarch who can barely breathe on this planet without micromanaging my aura, to somehow learn to perceive universal laws that even demigods struggle to comprehend. Then you want me to master them before I even qualify to sense them. And then, maybe, possibly, potentially, if the stars align and I don't implode. He raised both hands. I challenge gods. Silence. Leo pointed at him. That's not a plan. That's cosmic gambling. The projection opened his mouth, but Leo cut him off. And you say it so casually too. Oh yes, just perceive the architecture of time before you're meant to perceive it. No big deal. Miner sighed. Quest. He shook his head. You realize I'm not some limitless anomaly, right? I have thresholds. I have bottlenecks. I have a nervous system. His eyes narrowed slightly. I already almost die every other week. I do not need you inventing a new way for me to unravel conceptually. The projection folded his arms. You misunderstand. No, Leo said firmly. I understand perfectly. You're excited. You see a loophole in reality and now you want to test it. He exhaled slowly. And I'm the lab rat. The hut fell quiet. Leo looked at him with a thin, skeptical stare. I swear, if you say, trust me, next, I'm walking back through that portal. Leo warned, as the projection abruptly closed his mouth and frowned, as he realized that the kid knew him far too well for his liking. Chapter 1006 No Other Choice. For a while, both Leo and the projection sat in awkward silence, as Leo contemplated whether or not he even wanted to walk down such a path. The hut felt smaller now. The air felt heavier. And the idea of defying destiny sounded significantly less poetic and far more life-threatening the longer he thought about it. Eventually, it was the projection who broke the silence. Listen to me, young cult master. You might not know it, but my understanding of the laws of the universe is second to none. With my expertise and your talent, this might not be impossible. He proposed, as Leo slowly lifted his head in restrained frustration. There it was again. Might. Not impossible. As just listening to those words made him rub his temple hard. You do realize, Leo began calmly, that every time you say, might not be impossible, my survival instincts start screaming. The projection frowned slightly. Leo exhaled. This is insane. Completely insane. The kind of insane that has never been even attempted across history. He leaned back against the wall and stared at the ceiling of the hut. To be very honest, I don't want to try and break the loop of time. I don't want to challenge destiny. I don't want to be some experimental anomaly in your grand metaphysical research project. He paused, then sighed. But unfortunately, his tone shifted. I don't exactly have the luxury of picking safe options anymore. The projection watched him carefully now. I am the new cult master, Leo continued, a faint bitterness creeping into his voice. That's not a title I can shrug off. It's a target painted on my back. He looked up again, eyes steady. And your darling first son Caliph is not exactly the forgiving type. I killed his son, Raymond, in the recent war, and if there is one thing I am absolutely certain of, it's that the mad eternal sovereign is going to come for me sooner or later. His jaw tightened. And when he does, he's not coming for me alone. He's not coming half-heartedly. He's coming to erase everything. Me, the cult and the people I care about. Silence settled again. I don't get to say, this is too crazy, and walk away, Leo muttered. Because the alternative isn't just staying stagnant. It's annihilation. He gave a dry, humorless laugh. So yes, your plan sounds like it was drafted by a cosmic gambler high on theoretical optimism. He looked directly at the projection. But if the only way for me to stand against gods as a demigod, is to start learning the laws early. He closed his eyes briefly. Then I don't really have a choice, do I? The projection did not answer immediately. Leo opened his eyes again, resignation settling where resistance once stood. I'm not agreeing because I believe in your door, he said flatly. I'm agreeing because if I don't find more power soon, I'll lose everything that I hold so dear. A faint smirk tugged at his lips. And I'd rather be the blind painter trying to paint something impossible, than the idiot who stayed blind and got erased. He folded his arms. So fine. Let's say I'm your lab rat. He tilted his head slightly. Let's say I am agreeing to go on this journey with you. It doesn't mean, my patience with you is endless. If at any point, you lose your pragmatism and start talking in gibberish ominous nonsense, I'm not going to take the abuse lying down, and I'm going to push back hard this time motherfuck. Leo warned, as the projection frowned as though it was comically wrong. I don't know what your trauma is, boy, but I, for one, have never talked around the bush. Matter of fact, I don't talk much at all. I let my daggers do all the talking. The projection said in its defense, as Leo shook his head and let out a deep fake sigh. Meanwhile, inside a virtual conference, the 5 great clan gods. After Morris's unprovoked attack on Ruvasa, Yukiro called for an emergency virtual assembly of the 5 great clan gods, as their colossal projections materialized within a sealed chamber of shifting light, each one radiating restrained fury and unease. Yukiro did not waste time. This is absolutely unacceptable, he began, his voice cold and resonant. The deceiver has lost his mind, and we need to punish him for his actions. An unprovoked attack on one of us cannot be allowed to go unpunished. For if we hesitate now, he will only grow bolder in the future and there would be no stopping him. The others nodded with grave expressions, their auras flickering subtly as tension spread across the chamber. Ruvasa stepped forward next and removed her hand from the back of her neck, revealing the partially sealed wound where origin metal had carved into divine flesh, the corrupted edges still faintly resisting regeneration. A microsecond, she said evenly. If I was a microsecond slower, I would not be standing here. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Morris with an origin blade is far more dangerous than we initially believed, she continued. He tried to sweet-talk me into betraying the alliance, and joining him to form a new universal order. However, when I declined, he simply smiled and attacked. The man has become completely unhinged. Several of the clan gods exchanged dark looks. The implications were clear. If Ruvasa could be nearly decapitated within her own fortress, then none of them were beyond reach. This was not opportunism, Yukiro added grimly. It was an attempted assassination. The room fell into heavy silence as the great clan gods absorbed the reality of her injury, their expressions hardening as each silently considered the same unsettling thought. If Morris had chosen Vasa this time, who would be next? And whether or not the next target would even be fortunate enough to be left alive to tell the tale. Chapter 1007 Showing Spine. Inside a virtual conference, the 5 great clan gods. The atmosphere within the conference chamber was suffocatingly tense, because although every god present agreed that Morris had to be punished for his actions, an uncomfortable truth loomed over them all. Not one of them possessed an origin metal blade. And that absence changed everything. It always comes back to this, Luhan began at last, his voice measured but heavy with reluctant realism. While I do not disagree that we should collectively move against Morris, the simple fact remains that we lack the means to end him, whereas he does not. A grim silence followed. If we truly intend to hunt him down, then we will need power equal to his, Luhan continued. Which means we would have to ally ourselves with Caliph once again. Several expressions darkened at the name. And after the scathing letter of rejection we sent him not long ago, I am not entirely certain the Eternal Sovereign would even entertain such a proposal. His gaze swept across the projections. So unless all of you are prepared to place yourselves beneath Calith's banner once more. He paused deliberately. I do not see how this revenge plan succeeds. The chamber fell into uneasy silence as the weight of subservience settled uncomfortably over the alliance. For a while, nobody talked, until it was Yukiro that finally broke the silence. Regardless, this cannot be allowed to continue. If we do nothing today, then tomorrow it may be you who falls next, Luhan. He let the implication settle before continuing. And so this is my proposal. His expression hardened. We make one final attempt to bring Calith into alignment with us. We offer him limited concessions. Not subservience, not surrender, but rather controlled, strategic concessions in exchange for securing his strength against Morris. A few projections shifted subtly at that. If he accepts, then the matter resolves cleanly. But if he refuses, we move forward regardless. He said, as he squinted his eyes. We confront Morris ourselves. We engage him collectively. We disarm him if necessary and seize the origin metal blade. A tense silence followed. It is 5 against 1. I will not claim I can defeat Morris alone. But he is no Soren. He is dangerous, yes. But he is not invincible. His gaze swept across the assembly. Together, the 5 of us can hold our ground. And if we coordinate properly, we can bring him down. He suggested, as for the first time in years, it seemed as though he was not speaking from caution but rather from resolve. I agree with you. This needs to stop, Yu Shen said in firm support, as the fire that was started from Yukiro's speech seemed to spread onto him next. I say we make that bastard pay, Yu Shen added, as his killing intent flared as he said those words. I'm with you as well, Dutrask added next, his deep voice steady as his massive silhouette folded its arms across its chest, the gesture conveying both impatience and readiness. If we allow Morris to strike one of us without consequence, then we are no longer in alliance. We are prey waiting for our turn to be eaten. A low murmur of agreement followed, and even Luhan, who had initially urged caution, inclined his head slowly as though conceding to a reality he could no longer deny. I still believe the risks are substantial, he admitted, his tone measured but no longer resistant, but inaction carries a far greater danger, because hesitation now would only embolden Morris further and invite another strike, perhaps against one of us who may not be fortunate enough to survive it. One by one, the remaining clan gods voiced their assent, as the chamber that had moments earlier felt fractured by doubt now steadied into unified intent, and though the plan before them was dangerous and uncertain, it was at least decisive. As for the first time since Ruvasa revealed her wound, the 5 great clan gods were no longer sitting in fear of the deceiver's next move, but rather preparing to answer it. Meanwhile, within the Su clan, Su Yang's POV. Father, I have given this considerable thought, and I have made up my mind, Su Yang said firmly, standing tall before the head of the Su clan. Leo is the cult's new cult master, and he will not decline my request. So please, permit me to go. Su Tang did not respond immediately. He merely stroked his chin, studying his son with a mixture of reluctance and calculation. You understand what you are asking, Su Tang replied at last. A single day spent in that place is equivalent to 100 days here. Even a brief 6-month absence in the outside world would translate into decades within. Su Yang nodded without hesitation. That is precisely why I must go. If I take even 6 months away from my duties as the Su clan scion, I can return as a peak monarch warrior, ready to step into the demigod realm. His voice sharpened. The universe is shifting too quickly, father. The universal government is no more and the great clans are on the back foot. While Leo himself stands at the center of a rising storm. I cannot afford to remain stagnant. He clenched his fists. I am not satisfied with my current level of power. Su Yang expressed, as he sighed deeply, his eyes desperate yet defiant. However, in contrast, Su Tang only looked troubled. He understood the logic. The time-stilled world was an unparalleled training ground. The opportunity was real, but favors to the cult were never free. If Su Yang relied on them now, then one day, when the cult called upon him, he would be bound to answer. And that debt would not be small. Su Tang looked into his son's eyes and saw no hesitation there. Only resolve. And at that moment he realized that arguing further was going to accomplish nothing, which was why, after a long silence, he released a deep sigh as well. Very well, he said quietly. You may go. Chapter 1008 How to Master Time. Planet V***, inside the enchanted hut, Leo's POV. Once Leo had given his permission for the projection to train him, the projection wasted no more time and gave him his first assignment. There are 3 basic laws you must master before reaching the demigod realm. The projection began calmly, however, for now we will focus only on the first, the law of time, which happens to be the law I understand best. The projection explained, as Leo folded his arms in response. Are we starting from this law because it's the correct way forward, or because it's the most convenient for you? Leo asked sarcastically, as the projection ignored the sarcasm and moved on as though he did not hear the question. To understand the law of time, you must first grasp how differently time behaves in the third dimension compared to the fourth, because only when you begin to question why it flows the way it does in each realm, and what truly separates one experience from the other, will you slowly uncover what time actually is beneath perception. However, to get you started, let me explain the fundamental differences between time in the third dimension and the fourth. In the third dimension, time feels like a line, because you experience it as a sequence with a past, a present and a future, while your mind is forced to process one moment at a time. The projection began, as Leo nodded slowly. Yeah, that's normal. Leo replied, however, the projection shook his head in disappointment at that answer. It is not normal, the projection corrected. It is a limitation. You feel time is a line because you are inside it. The projection instructed, as Leo narrowed his eyes slightly. So what does it feel like outside it? He asked, as the projection's gaze sharpened. In the fourth dimension, time is not a line. It is a field. Leo blinked. A field. Yes. A field with direction, pressure, and curvature. While in the third dimension time only increases, in the fourth it leans. It bends. It pulls. Leo frowned. Time pulls. Have you never felt drift while traveling through the fourth dimension? The projection asked. Leo paused. I've felt resistance sometimes. Like the space wasn't smooth. That was not space, the projection said quietly. That was time. Leo straightened slightly. Explain. In the third dimension, you move through time unconsciously, the projection continued, as it carries you forward. But in the fourth, your aura can brush against the structure of time itself. Leo's expression hardened. And how exactly am I supposed to sense something I can't even see? You do not see it, the projection replied evenly. You spread your aura thin, like mist, and you let it feel. Leo gave him a flat look. I am not sure I follow. The projection sighed faintly. When you stretch your aura wide inside the fourth dimension and stop moving, you will begin to feel as though reality itself has a direction, a subtle leaning, like everything is drifting toward a slope. Leo went quiet. A slope. Yes. Time in the fourth dimension behaves like a gradient. Some regions flow smoothly. Some compress. Some distort. And gods? Leo asked. Gods can manipulate the gradient, the projection replied. That is why injury becomes temporary for them, because using divine essence they alter the gradient of time and heal themselves. Leo's jaw tightened slightly. And I cannot do that yet, because I don't have divine essence. Correct. You can only observe for now. While you will only apply your learnings once you already become a demigod. The projection said, as Leo nodded in understanding. So what's the assignment? Leo asked at last, as the projection finally gave him his homework. You will enter the fourth dimension and remain stationary, the projection said. You will not travel. You will anchor yourself here and spread your aura outward in a wide radius. Leo inhaled slowly. And I'm looking for drift. You are looking for 3 things, the projection continued. First, dominant flow direction. Which side of your aura feels pulled harder? Second, variance. Places where the pull changes suddenly. And third, anomalies. Scars in the temporal surface. Leo's eyes sharpened. Scars. You'll understand when you come across them, they'll literally be unlike anything you've seen otherwise. The projection explained, as Leo exhaled slowly. And I just observe. I don't touch. You can do nothing even if you do touch. For without divine essence you will always lack the means to manipulate time. So yeah, for now you observe and memorize, as you try to understand the true nature of time. Leo rubbed his temple lightly. And how long am I doing this? 1 hour a day to start. That's it. For now, the projection replied. Understanding comes in layers. If you try to comprehend too much too quickly, your mind will invent fake confidence. Leo gave him a sideways glance. That sounds ominous. It is pretty normal. Working too much is not always the best way to get things done. So yeah, for now you only study an hour a day, the projection instructed, as Leo nodded in understanding. So let me summarize, Leo said slowly. Time isn't a line in the fourth dimension. It's a field. It leans. It bends. It has pressure. Yes. And I can feel it by thinning my aura. Yes. And I'm not learning to control it. I'm learning to understand it. The projection nodded once. Fantastic. So step 1 of defying destiny is becoming a glorified cosmic weather sensor, Leo said sarcastically, as the projection did not react to his words. It is step 1 of not being blind, he replied calmly, as Leo stared at the ground for a moment, then finally nodded. Fine. He cracked his neck slowly. 1 hour. His aura began to stir faintly around him. And if I come back saying I felt absolutely nothing? The projection's eyes gleamed faintly. Then you simply try again tomorrow. Chapter 1009 Training. Planet V Star, Leo's POV. After grasping the basics of what the projection wanted him to sense, Leo wasted no more time, as he opened a fourth-dimensional portal and stepped right through. FWOOSH. The world shifted instantly as color dulled and sound flattened into a muted hum, while distance felt strangely unanchored, as though space itself no longer followed intuitive rules. Step. He walked several measured steps forward, far enough that the opening behind him became an anchor rather than a distraction, and then he stopped moving entirely, planting his feet firmly as he allowed his body and thoughts to settle into complete stillness. For several seconds he did nothing but breathe, before slowly and deliberately spreading his aura outward, like mist dispersing across still water, as he stretched it in all directions to form a wide circular field around himself while focusing only on sensing drift, slope, gradient, or any variation that resembled what the projection had described. However, much to his annoyance, only silence greeted him. No pull tugged at one side of his aura, no subtle leaning brushed against his perception, and no distortion disturbed the symmetry of his expanded field. As he closed his eyes and thinned his aura even further, reducing its density while increasing its sensitivity, forcing himself to relax rather than strain, remembering clearly the warning about inventing false sensations out of impatience. Minutes passed in quiet concentration as he remained stationary, his mind calm and breath steady while his aura threads brushed against the invisible structure of the dimension, yet nothing answered him in return. He felt space. He sensed faint fluctuations in dimensional pressure. But time, if it truly existed here as a gradient, remained indistinguishable from the background. By the time the hour drew to a close, a restrained irritation had begun to form beneath his composure, not because he lacked focus, but because despite following every instruction precisely and maintaining perfect stillness, he had detected nothing of significance, no slope, no variance, no scars, only the quiet, indifferent vastness of the fourth dimension itself. Sigh. When the hour finally ended, Leo exhaled slowly as he retracted his aura in controlled increments before reopening a portal and stepping back into the hut, where the projection observed him with an expression that suggested he had expected exactly this outcome. I felt dimensional pressure and spatial distortion, but nothing that resembled a temporal gradient, Leo said evenly, his tone controlled but faintly edged with frustration. If time truly behaves like a field here, then it is either impossibly subtle or I am still blind to it. The projection showed no disappointment, as he simply nodded once and replied that such an outcome was entirely expected, because senses conditioned for a lifetime within the third dimension would not suddenly recalibrate after a single hour of exposure, and that mastery of even one of the three fundamental laws was never a matter of a single attempt, but rather of persistence sustained across countless failures. Leo rubbed the back of his neck as he absorbed those words, feeling no triumph and no revelation from his first attempt, only the quiet weight of an unseen structure that refused to reveal itself, while the projection concluded calmly that they would continue tomorrow, and that progress would come not from forcing insight, but from returning again and again until perception finally sharpened enough to detect what had always been there. Meanwhile, Calith's POV. In a development that Calith could only describe as both unexpected and advantageous, just as he began contemplating how to reclaim the favor of the great clans and draw them back under his influence, it was the great clan gods themselves who reached out to him first, bearing a proposal so surprising that even he had not anticipated such an approach. Respected Eternal Sovereign, due to recent developments where the deceiver Morris has bared his fangs against the great clans, we have collectively decided to reconsider our alliance with the universal government, and decided to redraw an arrangement under new terms. If acceptable to you, the great clans would like to re-recognize the legitimacy of the universal government, and adopt a singular trade and governance structure that would be solely governed by you. In return, we would expect you to help us punish the deceiver, and become a long-term ally of the great clans. Please note, while we do plan to acknowledge the legitimacy of the universal government as an organization, we do not accept being subservient to it, which means, any and all decisions made by the universal government would be suggestions rather than binding decisions, which each clan can choose to follow or not. However, in our eyes this is a win-win for all, as together, not only can we curtail the influence of Morris but also of the dragon Moltheric and the cult. Eagerly awaiting a response. Yu Kiro. The letter read, as reading it, Caliph could not help but smile from ear to ear. Morris, Morris, Morris. You're an absolute nightmare to have as an ally. However, you're even worse to have as an enemy. Caliph muttered, as he chuckled at how a single attack by Morris achieved what he could probably never have accomplished on his own. It's interesting that they want to make me a nominal head, who is nothing more than a glorified leader of a crumbling organization. However, under the current universal climate, I don't mind that at all. As long as they back me while I take down the cult, and protect me from the aftermath, I'll become a nominal head if I have to. Caliph muttered, as he understood perfectly well that the great clans were still adamant about not becoming subservient to him. However, he decided to let it slide for the time being, as long as the optics of his supremacy remained intact. Unexpected for sure. However, it seems like it won't take me a decade to exact my revenge on the cult after all. Chapter 1010 Confrontation. 7 days later, Planet Ixtal, Leo's POV. No, 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 no. Amanda screamed, as she bit her lips hard and tried her best to hold back her tears. You have been disappearing every day for an hour and a half, going off only God knows where, and I know it in my bones that you're off someplace training. I know it, because every time you embark on a training adventure, even when you're not busy training, you're constantly thinking about it, and I see those same patterns in you all over again. She complained, as Leo stood mute in front of her, shaking his head in casual denial. We had a deal, Leo. You promised me you will be a family man once the war was over. You promised, Amanda said, her voice breaking as the tears finally started to roll down freely across her cheeks. Darling, listen to me. Leo began, as he raised a hand to place on her shoulder and console her. However, Amanda immediately swatted him away, as she refused his comfort at this moment. Slap. Don't. She warned, lifting a single finger up, as despite the tears, the redness around the whites of her eyes depicted a fury unlike no other. Don't darling me today, Leo, or I'll really snap. Amanda warned, as Leo reluctantly backed off. Do you even understand what you did today? Do you even know? She asked accusingly, as Leo simply stared at her in confusion, feeling clueless on what went wrong. Of course you don't. Because in that head of yours, the only thing that's happening in the background is training. Whereas human emotions and family values have no room. She concluded, as Leo felt attacked for no reason whatsoever. When was the last time you met your brother Luke? When was the last time you asked how your sister-in-law Alia was doing? Or how their son Leonardo is faring? Did you know, Leonardo is a transcendent tier warrior now? That he made lieutenant? Of course you don't, because the last time you asked about them was over 2 months ago. Amanda scolded, as Leo simply shrugged his shoulders, as if unable to connect this to what specifically he did wrong today. Oh, so it's like that huh? Amanda said in disbelief, as she shook her head in disappointment. Today when Myron came up to you with a crayon drawing of our family, what did you do Leo, what did you say to the little boy? Amanda asked, as Leo recalled the interaction he had with his youngest son Myron this morning, where Myron brought up to him a crude family portrait that he had made. What? I told him it's such a good painting. I said, good job buddy, but daddy doesn't wear armor. And even if he did, it would be black not red. Leo replied, as Amanda felt her blood boil all over again, as her face reddened even more. And, do you still not see what you did wrong? Amanda asked, as Leo scratched the back of his head in utter confusion. This seemed like a perfectly normal conversation to him, and he could not understand what the fuss was all about. Leo, you're ridiculous. Do you even understand why Myron likes to draw and paint? It's because he thinks his daddy loves to draw and paint. Because that's what I've told him. The kids idolize you. For them you're the greatest hero of their life. And that's precisely why I need you to be a better example for them. Amanda began, as she shared with Leo a perspective that his warrior self could never see. The painting that Myron painted had both you and Caleb wearing armor. While I held a hammer, and Myron held nothing. That was his way of telling you that he's feeling lonely. And that with Caleb busy training, he's feeling left behind as of late. He will turn 4 in a month for God's sake, Leo, he's just a child. And he needs more emotional support from you than a, good job buddy, or pointing out the color of your armor. Amanda screamed, as Leo felt goosebumps arise all over his skin. Never in his life had he heard Amanda be this angry before, and now that she had finally snapped today, he could not help but feel frightened. What can I say babe? Maybe I'm not as empathetic as you. I would never knowingly ignore my children's feelings, however, I can't draw inferences from art like this, like you. I don't understand what you want from me here, but I can assure you. I'm already doing the best I can. Leo replied, as although he regretted the current situation, he absolutely refused to make any concessions here, as he firmly believed that the hour-a-day training that he had started to do was something absolutely necessary for the future of the cult and the long-term security of the family. No, Leo. You're not doing the best you can for this family. Maybe you're doing the best you can do for yourself and the cult. But not for this family. Because the Leo the first fell in love with could do much more than this. Amanda said, as Leo involuntarily scoffed at her words. Amanda, do you realize how big of a target I have on my back hereby? Being cult master, do you realize how big of a target our children have on their backs? Just because they share my blood. If I don't continue to grow stronger, sooner or later there will come a foe that will take our kids away from us. And I'm just working hard to ensure that such a future won't come to pass. Leo argued, as Amanda shook her head in disagreement. But what about today, Leo? What about Myron's feelings today? What about being present for them today? Not just physically, but also emotionally. When will you stop being a security guard and start being a father? She asked, as yet another tear slid down her cheek. With the way you are, the children will surely grow up to detest you. Or grow up without feeling emotionally connected to you. And I'm not going to have that. I'm going to wait for a few more days, Leo, for you to get your act together. If you do, great. If not, I'm going to leave Ixtal with Caleb and Myron, and start a new life in some corner of the universe where you won't have to worry about our safety and security anymore. I'll raise them alone, just the way Mama Elena raised you and Luke, and you can meet them again once they're of age. But no way in hell are you going to be a part of the life of my kids. With the way you are right now. Amanda concluded before storming away, as she left Leo at a loss for words. Chapter 10-11 Brotherly Request. Planet Ixtal, Leo's Pa. The next day. The morning after his argument with Amanda, Leo was informed that an unexpected visitor had arrived on Ixtal, and despite the lingering tension at home, he could not help but feel a faint shift in mood when he learned that the visitor was none other than his longtime rival, Su Yang. Skyshard, you dog. I can't believe you killed Raymond in a one-on-one fight. Su Yang said as soon as he met Leo, as he gave his old rival a good dap up before proceeding to give him a short hug. Ha ha ha. And I can't believe you're still such a weak man. Like come on, not even a monarch yet. Leo jibed, as Su Yang instantly turned a couple shades redder. What can I say, man? Not all of us have access to a super training chamber with dense mana flows and a 100-factor time latency. Only a fortunate few do. And then they flex their gains live for trillions to see. Su Yang said, as Leo let out a short mirthless laugh at his words. He had missed this banter with Su Yang over the past few years, as of all the warriors and leaders that surrounded him, he only shared this light friendly rivalry with Su Yang and Ver. So, what brings you here so unexpectedly? I doubt you flew across the universe just to congratulate me. Leo asked, as Su Yang's grin did not fade, though it shifted into something more deliberate. I'm here to train. I've thought about it for months now, and I've finally made up my mind. With your blessing, I want access to the cult's infamous time-stilled world. Give me a few months outside time, and I'll come out of it a completely different man. Su Yang said casually, though there was an unmistakable seriousness beneath the light tone. Leo did not respond immediately. He kept walking, hands clasped behind his back as the wind brushed against his robes, his mind already weighing implications that Su Yang could not see, as he worried about the cult's secrets such as its advanced machinery and its mana-refining tricks being leaked to the outside universe. After all, the time-stilled world was not just a training chamber. It was a utopia, a development center, and one of the cult's most important assets. You do realize, Leo said slowly, that what you're asking for isn't a simple favor. The time-stilled world isn't some rented cultivation cave. It houses cult technology, relics, and mechanisms that cannot be exposed to outsiders. Su Yang did not flinch. I'm not asking to roam your archives, Skyshard. Lock me in a training zone. Strip my access. Blindfold me if you have to. I don't care about your secrets. I only care about my personal power. He replied, displaying no arrogance in his tone, only hunger. For a long moment, Leo said nothing. Then he stopped walking and looked at Su Yang properly, searching his face for ulterior motives, for calculation, for political maneuvering. Only to find none, as he finally relented. Sigh. For anyone else making this request, I'd probably say no. However, for you, I'll agree, he said evenly, though the decision was not a light one. Su Yang's face brightened instantly, as though someone had ignited a lantern behind his eyes. Ha, I knew you weren't completely heartless. Come on now Skyshard, drink with a brother for a change. He declared triumphantly as he pulled a dark glass bottle from his spatial ring along with 2 ceremonial Sioux clan crystal glasses etched with silver patterns, as Leo raised an eyebrow at the abrupt request. You came prepared? He asked. Of course I did, Su Yang replied as he poured generously into both glasses. If you rejected me, I was planning to drown my sorrows. Anyway, he said, as Leo let out a short breath of amusement before accepting the glass. Fine, but if this wine is weak, I'm revoking your access. Leo teased, as the 2 clanked glasses and drank. A couple hours later, with the sun dipping lower over Ixtal's horizon and the bottle significantly lighter, both men sat on the terrace railing with far less formality than before, their shoulders relaxed and their speech slightly slower, though neither was truly out of control. Su Yang tilted his head slightly and smirked. So tell me, Skyshard. How's married life? How's it like being the father of 2 little warriors? He asked with exaggerated curiosity, as Leo let out a low chuckle. It's great for the most part. Except sometimes when my wife expects me to manifest the spirit of Picasso and read between the brush strokes. He replied dryly as he took another sip. Su Yang blinked at him. I have absolutely no idea what that means. He admitted, as Leo waved a dismissive hand. Exactly. He shot back before turning the question around. What about you? Did no girl catch your heart yet? Or are you leaning towards the men these days? He asked with a sideways grin, as Su Yang scoffed loudly. Of course a few did. Her name was Su Tria. Very gorgeous. Perfectly silky silver hair. Big chest. Bigger ass. We made love for 7 days and 7 nights. He said dramatically as he raised his glass, and Leo raised his in return. With a slow nod of approval. Then my heart moved on to Su Lori. Beautiful lips. Beautiful black eyes. Very flexible in bed. We made love for 7 days and 7 nights. Ahahaha. He burst out laughing mid-story, nearly spilling his drink. Leo stared at him for a second before shaking his head in disbelief. You're unbelievable, he muttered. Su Yang wiped his mouth and grinned shamelessly. I'm just not built to be tied down yet. The universe is large, and my heart is generous, he declared, as Leo scoffed softly, though there was no real judgment behind it. Or you're just scared, he said calmly, as Su Yang's grin widened. Maybe, but at least I sleep well, he replied, as the 2 sat there in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sky darken as distant stars began to flicker into view, their rivalry momentarily replaced by something far simpler, the quiet ease of 2 men who had fought each other, competed against each other, and yet somehow grown into brothers along the way. As for the first time since his argument with Amanda, Leo felt his shoulders loosen just slightly, as he realized that maybe the 2 of them disagreeing for the first time wasn't the end of the world. Chapter 1012 Sisterly Advice. At the same time, Planet Ixtal, Amanda's POV. While Leo spent the day unwinding with Su Yang as though nothing had happened, Amanda spent hers in quiet unrest, waiting for Alia, who arrived on Ixtal in haste after receiving her urgent message. What's going on? Why did you call me here so suddenly? Is everything alright? Alia asked the moment she stepped inside, concern evident in her voice as she took in Amanda's red eyes and strained expression. Amanda tried to offer a small smile, but it faltered almost immediately, her fingers twisting together tightly in her lap as she gestured for Alia to sit beside her on the bed, the weight of unspoken frustration and hurt lingering heavily in the room. Whoa, whoa, whoa. You look like you've cried all night. That's so unusual for you, love. What happened? Alia asked, as Amanda spontaneously broke into tears once more, unable to process the bulk of emotions she was feeling at this moment. Sob. Sob. For a while, she said nothing as she simply cried her heart out, before finally mustering the courage to form words, as she said. I had a big fight with Leo yesterday. Probably the first one we have ever had. And I don't think my words got through to him at all. I don't understand Leo sometimes, or how his head works. Because, it's like he's always looking for that one big mistake, that one reason that led to me being unhappy. Whereas, it's never just one incident for me. It's a routine problem. What bothers me is not the fact that he is going out to train 1 hour a day again. Hell, 1 hour is actually a lot less than I'd typically expect him to run off for. However, my problem is with that 1 hour also consuming the remaining 23 hours of his day. Because whenever he starts training, it's almost like even when he is with me, he's not. Amanda began, her voice feeble as she looked into Alia's eyes for reassurance. Go on, Alia said reaffirmingly, her expression focused, as she encouraged Amanda to go on. The moment Leo starts to train, it's like the training consumes all of his mind, and this is not a new phenomenon. I know this, because I've known him since we first met on the Ark ship, and although it's one of his many endearing qualities, sometimes I just hope he would choose his family over everything else. The 1 hour a day he goes off to train, it wouldn't bother me if he was actually present here mentally and emotionally for the remaining 23, however, because I know he's incapable of doing that, I tried to push him to quit his training, and now I feel bad for trying to manipulate him. Amanda admitted, as her eyes darkened with shame. However, I did not do it for me. I myself am fine with however little attention he gives me. However, I want nothing but the best for the kids. Especially since they look up to him like he's their idol. For them, I want him to be the best father he can be, and right now, I just feel like he's not quite there yet. He's trying, sometimes, but he's definitely not there yet. And I'm not happy. Amanda explained, as Alia let out a deep sigh. Being married to another Skyshard herself, she perfectly understood Amanda's struggles at this moment, however, she could also see her flaws. What Amanda wanted from Leo was not wrong, however, her method to achieve it definitely was. In the end, I threatened to take the kids away and leave if he didn't clean up his act. Because I'd rather the kids grow up and have a perfect image of him. Then let them be around the real him and grow up with a tarnished image of a man they don't respect or idolize. For them right now, he's a man who can do no wrong. And I would much rather it stay that way. Amanda concluded, as Alia finally opened her mouth to intervene. You know honey, when I was raising Leonardo, I faced much of the same issues. Luke never had a father growing up. And hence, he did not understand the role of a father in a kid's life. When we had Leonardo, he did not understand when he was supposed to be strict. And when he wasn't, he did not understand how to show affection. And when to punish the kid, as he had no first-hand experience. So naturally, there were a lot of moments where I was disappointed in him. However, over time I just realized that I was disappointed because of my own expectations, versus what he actually did. Because, although clueless, in his own way Luke was in fact always trying his best to raise Leonardo. And although it was not the way I wanted it to be, he still managed to be a great father to him. So, my only advice to you is, trust Leo as well. It may not be the way you want. But in his own way, he will raise the kids the best he can. Alia explained, as Amanda listened to her words with her head down. In shame, she hated fighting with Leo. She hated how it made her feel. She understood perfectly that what he brought to the parents' dynamic was completely different to what she did, and yet, somehow she couldn't help but be greedy and want even more, just because she knew he was capable of giving more. Sigh, I guess you're right. I guess I should maybe apologize. Amanda accepted, as Alia giggled at her words. Apologize? Oh no honey. You never apologize to Skyshard men, or you'll just inflate their nearly empty heads even more. What you should do is take Caleb and Myron away on a short 2-day surprise vacation, and give Leo a mini heart attack. By the time you're back, he would have reflected on stuff he would never otherwise think about, and when you're back you can just tell him about how life without him feels wrong, and he will just melt all over again. Do it right, and not only will your marriage be perfectly healthy again, but so will your night life. Alia said while winking, as it was only now that Amanda found out as to how devious his sister-in-law really was. Chapter 10-13 Background Deals. The next day, Planet Ixtal, Amanda's POV. The next day, acting on Alia's rather mischievous advice, Amanda attempted to quietly whisk the children away on a short trip back to the time-stilled world, hoping to execute her plan without drawing unnecessary attention. However, much to her misfortune, she ran into an unexpected obstacle standing squarely in her path, a certain large, green beast known as Dumpy. Lady Mother, why are you headed for the Hangar Bay area with the children? And where is Su Pei? Need I remind you that the Skyshard family is to never roam without adequate protection? Dumpy asked, as Amanda felt her heart sink in her chest when she saw the big green beast appear before her out of nowhere. It's Dumpy. Mom look, it's the squishy green frog. Caleb and Myron said excitedly as they pointed towards Dumpy in joy, which caused the otherwise stoic frog to crack a rare smile. We are going to the time-stilled world to buy a surprise gift for your Lord Father. It's a surprise, so I don't want anyone to know about it. Which is also why I haven't asked Su Pei to accompany us. As you must know, your Lord Father is trying so hard as of late to keep everything around here running smoothly, which is why I thought, why not do something special for him to make his day? Amanda said nervously, lying through her teeth as she placed a hand behind her head. For a moment, she fully expected Dumpy to see through her lie and call her out. However, to her surprise, Dumpy did not do so and instead nodded in agreement. Lord Father is indeed working extremely hard as of late, and will definitely be overjoyed if his family shows him some special attention. You need not worry, Lady Mother, if you don't want to bring Su Pei alongside you, then it will be I, Dumpy, who will accompany you. However, I will never let you or the children travel without a proper escort. Dumpy declared, as he shrunk his size and forcibly joined his way into the party, as he insisted on accompanying them. Oh no, Amanda thought internally, as having Dumpy by her side completely defeated the purpose of a surprise getaway. However, having no other option, she reluctantly accepted it in the end, as she continued to make her way to the Hangar Bay area, hoping that the news of their departure did not reach Leo for at least the next 24 hours. Meanwhile, Yukiro's POV. When Yukiro sent Kalith a letter on behalf of the entire Great Clan Alliance, he did not have much expectation for the Eternal Sovereign to accept their demands, because rulers of Kalith's stature rarely returned to negotiations after being publicly rejected, since pride was often more valuable to them than convenience. However, to his surprise, Kalith accepted every proposal they had outlined, countering them with only one condition, as though he had already anticipated that the alliance would eventually circle back to him. Kalith's only demand was that if Multharic ever came after him, the Great Clan Alliance needed to step forward in his defense, as in return, he promised to help them eliminate Morris and accept a diminished role in universal governance. As Yukiro read the response, an unpleasant sensation settled in his stomach, because although the terms appeared balanced, he understood that aligning with Kalith meant tying their fate to his in a way that could not be undone casually. A deal with a devil never came without its price, and while Kalith had not asked for subservience or public submission, what he demanded instead was commitment, which in many ways was more binding than kneeling ever could be. Yet when Yukiro forced himself to examine the proposal rationally, he could not deny the obvious truth, which was that to take down Morris, they needed a fighter who wielded an origin metal blade, and Kalith was currently the only force capable of providing that balance. Well, it's not like we did not intend to deal with the ancient dragon eventually, Yukiro muttered to himself as he reread the final clause, because Multharic had long been an unstable factor in the cosmic order, and confronting him with Kalith's support could potentially reduce long-term risk for the great clans too. I guess this is acceptable, Yukiro muttered, as with that conclusion forming, he forwarded Kalith's response to the remaining great clan gods, attaching a brief assessment that outlined the strategic necessity of the alliance while acknowledging the political cost of binding themselves to the Eternal Sovereign once more. Responses returned steadily, some cautious and some resigned, yet none outright rejecting the logic, because every one of them understood that without Kalith, confronting Morris would be an unnecessary gamble, and that unity, however uncomfortable, was preferable to fragmentation. In the end, consensus formed not from enthusiasm but from necessity, as the Great Clan Alliance collectively agreed to Kalith's demand, accepting that mutual defense against Multharic was a reasonable price in exchange for securing his strength against Morris. As an emergency virtual conference was scheduled shortly thereafter, bringing together the 5 great clan gods and the Eternal Sovereign in a sealed chamber where terms were restated clearly, responsibilities defined without ambiguity, and the future structure of cooperation laid out in precise language. Kalith remained composed throughout the discussion, neither pressing advantage nor displaying arrogance, which only reinforced Yukiro's understanding that this was not a desperate ruler seeking validation, but a sovereign who knew exactly when to extend his hand. When all clauses had been clarified, an oath was sworn upon the souls of every god present, binding them to mutual defense and coordinated offense, and sealing the alliance under spiritual consequence should betrayal ever occur. When the projections faded and the chamber emptied, Yukiro remained seated for a moment longer, aware that while they had secured the strength necessary to confront Morris, they had also entered into a far larger struggle, one where their future seemed shaky at best. Chapter 10:14 Time for Retribution. Meanwhile, the Eternal Garden, Kalith's POV. Kalith stood alone upon the rocky cliffside of the Eternal Garden, his robes shifting gently in the ocean wind as he gazed across the restless sea below. Not far in front of him, 2 tombstones stood carved into sacred stone, one bearing the name of Raymond, and the other, Soren. For a long moment he said nothing, simply staring at the horizon as though the ocean itself could offer counsel, before a faint smile curved along his lips, not one of joy, but one of resolve hardened over time, while his eyes reflected a cold determination that had long since replaced grief. Today, I finally get to avenge you, my son. He spoke quietly, his voice steady and controlled as the wind carried his words outward into the endless blue, and almost on cue a sharp wave crashed against the rocks beneath him, sending a spray of fine mist upward that brushed against his face and hair without drawing even the slightest reaction from him. He then turned slowly toward the second grave, his gaze resting upon Soren's name etched deeply into stone, and for a fleeting moment the faint smile faded into something far more complicated, as memory and regret crossed his features in restrained silence. "Forgive me, brother, but I am about to destroy your beloved Ixtal in full." Another wave struck the cliffside with force, scattering droplets across his robes as though the sea itself objected to his declaration, yet Caliph remained unmoved, his posture straight and unyielding as he continued without hesitation. "I know how much that planet meant to you, and in truth it held meaning for me as well. However, I have already spared it once out of sentiment, believing that restraint would earn respect, but I will not repeat that mistake again." His jaw tightened slightly as he lifted his chin toward the horizon, the softness that had once accompanied nostalgia replaced now by calculated finality. "Today, I destroy it for once and for all." The wind intensified briefly, another surge of ocean water striking the rocks below as if punctuating his decision, while Caliph's eyes narrowed in quiet focus. "Leo Skyshard, today you will learn that every action carries consequences, and that killing my son was never going to end without retribution." He clasped his hands behind his back as his aura stirred faintly around him, steady and immense, no longer restrained by uncertainty. "With the great clan alliance now standing behind me, I no longer fear retaliation from Multheric, and without that threat hanging over me, there is nothing left to delay what must be done." He paused only once more, allowing the weight of his intent to settle into certainty before moving ahead. "Today, I come for Ixtal. Let us see what you can do about that." He dared, as with that final declaration, he extended a hand forward as space before him distorted and folded inward, forming a stable fourth-dimensional portal whose edges shimmered faintly against the sea breeze. "Today, I come for retribution," he muttered, as without the slightest trace of hesitation, he stepped through the portal and vanished toward Ixtal. Meanwhile, Planet V*, Leo's POV. As per his daily training routine, Leo returned to Planet V*, where the projection of the timeless assassin greeted him with a courteous nod, standing just outside the small hut as though he had been waiting for him all along. "Cult Master." The projection acknowledged calmly. "Crazy projection." Leo replied without hesitation, meeting his gaze evenly as the faintest smirk tugged at his lips. The projection frowned immediately, clearly displeased by the title, as though after days of instruction and philosophical exposition, he had expected at least a slight elevation in how he was addressed. "I see your respect for your teacher continues to evolve backward," he remarked dryly, as Leo merely shrugged in response. "Don't let it get to your head," Leo said, as the projection exhaled lightly, choosing not to dwell on the insult, as he shifted the conversation back to what mattered. "Ready for your session today?" he asked, his tone returning to its usual measured calm. However, Leo did not immediately answer, instead lifting a hand to scratch the back of his head as though something far less theoretical than temporal gradients weighed upon him. The projection narrowed his eyes slightly. "What is it, boy? Is there something you wish to ask me?" he inquired, folding his arms as he observed Leo more closely. Leo let out a slow breath. "Yeah, it's about my family issues. I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing, and I was hoping to get your opinion on it," he admitted reluctantly as the projection's expression shifted into one of serious consideration, as though preparing to dispense wisdom refined across centuries. "If you are experiencing any performance issues in bed, I do know a few alchemical formulas that will turn you into an absolute beast," he offered solemnly, as Leo recoiled immediately at the suggestion. No, you perverted old man. I'm not having issues in bed," he protested, visibly flustered. "It's more of a marriage issue," he began again, only for the projection to interrupt him with startling enthusiasm. "You are uncertain whether you should remain tied to one woman." He leaned forward slightly. "Take my advice, boy. Absolutely do not bind yourself unnecessarily. There is no strategic advantage in restricting your legacy to a single womb when the universe is vast and receptive," he declared, before letting out a short, satisfied laugh at his own reasoning. Leo stared at him in open disbelief. "Right, that explains a lot," he muttered under his breath as the projection blinked in confusion. "Explains what?" he asked, as Leo waved a dismissive hand. "Never mind," Leo said, shaking his head, as though already regretting his decision. "To seek counsel from the old man. I think I'll hold off on the advice for now. I'd rather take advice from a divorced man than from you," he said flatly, as the projection stiffened slightly at that, clearly insulted for the second time in as many minutes, though he chose not to escalate the matter. "Your personal incompetence in choosing conversational topics is not my concern," he replied curtly, as Leo ignored him entirely, closing his eyes briefly as he forced his thoughts back toward discipline, pushing aside the emotional noise that had prompted the question in the first place. All right, enough of that, he murmured, cracking his neck lightly. Let's get back to the study of time. Without waiting for further commentary, Leo stepped forward and began preparing to open a fourth-dimensional portal once again, as the projection, still mildly offended yet professionally composed, allowed the matter to drop and refocused his attention on the training at hand. After all, even flawed disciples required guidance. And despite his questionable romantic philosophy, the timeless assassin had never failed in matters that truly mattered. Chapter 10-15 Doom. Meanwhile, planet Ixtal. After Raymond's conquest of the cult lands, Ixtal, like many other planets caught in the wake of that campaign, had been left in complete ruin, its cities fractured, its infrastructure reduced to debris, and its people scattered between survival zones and the relative safety of the time-stilled world. As it was not until Leo ascended as the cult master that the true reconstruction of Ixtal began in earnest, as organized efforts replaced desperate patchwork repairs and long-term rebuilding plans were finally set into motion across the shattered planet. Entire sectors that had previously stood as skeletal reminders of conflict were gradually brought back to life, rising beneath layers of scaffolding and controlled mana furnaces that worked day and night to reshape broken stone and twisted metal. Merchants reopened modest stalls along newly repaired avenues, children's laughter cautiously returned to public squares, and the cult's banners, once torn and faded, were raised again with renewed purpose as hope slowly began to replace the fear that had once gripped the planet's heart. Although the scars of battle still lingered across the horizon and certain regions remained sealed for long-term restoration, the general sentiment across Ixtal had shifted from survival to rebuilding. As families began reclaiming homes, soldiers resumed structured patrols instead of emergency mobilizations, and for the first time in a long while, the planet no longer felt like a battlefield but a homeland struggling its way back toward normalcy. Meanwhile, Supei. Within one of the partially reconstructed districts, Supei stood alone. Amidst a shoddy training ground, focusing entirely on his own advancement as he cycled mana through his body in disciplined intervals, striking reinforced targets with measured force to refine both control and efficiency. Plop. Boom. Unlike his usual duties of shadowing the Skyshard family and ensuring their safety against unseen dangers, today Supei had chosen to take a day off and train, for he did not wish to stagnate as a warrior even though he doubted his potential to ever rise to a demigod. Sigh. A heavy exhale left his lungs as he completed another sequence of controlled strikes, the air around him rippling faintly with monarch-level pressure while distant workers paused momentarily to observe the reassuring sight of a high-ranking protector training openly among them, a subtle reminder that the cult's strength remained intact. It was then, without warning and without gradual distortion, that the space above Ixtal tore open. FWOOSH. A fourth-dimensional portal manifested high in the sky, its edges sharp and stable, as Caliph emerged from within. Choke. Kneel. Almost immediately, an oppressive pressure covered the entire planet, as Caliph remained suspended in the air with his robes unruffled and his posture immaculate, as he swept his gaze across Ixtal's rebuilding cities with cold appraisal. Fuck me. Supei muttered under his breath as the realization settled heavily in his chest, his instincts flaring sharply as they locked onto the overwhelming presence above, as in that single, silent instant, he understood with brutal clarity that he was going to die soon. Clench. Supei's jaw tightened as he tore his gaze away from the suffocating figure suspended in the heavens and instinctively glanced down at the timepiece wrapped around his wrist, its display flickering faintly as it showed the time. 5:20 p.m. The clock read, as his throat went dry. 5 to 6 was the Lord's daily training window, the 1 hour where Leo vanished from Ixtal without fail to pursue personal growth. Which meant there were at least 40 minutes before he would return. 40 minutes that Ixtal likely did not possess. Sigh. A hollow breath escaped him as conflicting emotions tangled in his chest. I don't know whether to be relieved or devastated that the Lord isn't here right now, Supei muttered quietly, his eyes never leaving the distant silhouette above. Maybe it's for the best, because even though I believe in miracles, I don't think even the Lord would survive a direct assault from the eternal sovereign at his current strength. There was no bitterness in his tone, only realism sharpened by experience, as he looked at his trembling hands in disgust, before eventually clenching his fists, as he resisted Caliph's pressure. Alarms blaring, commoners screaming. All around him, common civilians had already started to collapse in panic as alarms began to echo through half-reconstructed districts that had only just begun to feel safe again. As many just like Supei realized that Caliph coming to Ixtal could only mean disaster for them. I guess this is it for me, Supei muttered, as he straightened slowly, his aura expanding forward, as he lifted himself deliberately into the sky with measured composure, acknowledging without hesitation that until Leo returned, he was the sole shield standing between Ixtal and annihilation. High above, Caliph observed the movement with mild curiosity. For a fleeting moment, as he hovered over the recovering planet, something unbidden stirred within him. It had been a few millennia since he last stood above Ixtal's skies, and despite everything that had transpired, there had once been years of his life where this world had felt like home. He remembered its former skyline, its unscarred continents, the way its mana currents had once flowed clean and uninterrupted when he was still a kid. As for a brief second, disbelief flickered through him at how desolate it currently appeared. However, sentiment, once acknowledged, was dismissed, as the softness evaporated as quickly as it had surfaced and was instead replaced by the cold resolve that had brought him here. He raised an eyebrow as his senses swept across the planet in search of greater resistance. There were transcendents scattered throughout the cities, soldiers scrambling into formation, defensive arrays activating too slowly to matter, yet among them only one monarch-tier signature ascended to meet him. Su Pei. Calith's gaze sharpened. He had come for one target and one target alone, Leo Skyshard, yet the absence of the cult master at such a moment intrigued him. Is this all that stands between me and Ixtal? He murmured softly, as Su Pei continued rising through the heavens, alone and unwavering, toward a battle he already knew he could not win. Chapter 10:16 Loyalty. Although Caliph could have erased Su Pei with nothing more than a stray thought, he chose not to, allowing the cult monarch to ascend through the suffocating pressure with dignity, as he watched in silence until Su Pei reached his altitude before speaking. Do you know why I am here, child? Caliph asked calmly, his tone devoid of urgency, as if they were two old acquaintances meeting beneath peaceful skies rather than enemies suspended above a trembling planet. Scoff. Su Pei scoffed lightly, though the strain in his breathing betrayed the immense force pressing down upon him. I do not, eternal sovereign. But unless you're here for a glass of lemonade or a cup of hot tea, anything beyond that is outside my scope of hospitality. He replied dryly, gripping the hilt of his sword to steady the tremor in his fingers, as Caliph's lips curved into a faint chuckle. Humorous even in the face of death. You are a true warrior. As expected of a cult monarch. Caliph said, raising his hands in slow, deliberate applause, the sound of his polite clapping echoing unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. So, shall we begin? Su Pei asked, drawing his blade fully now as its edge shimmered with monarch-tier mana. I've always wanted to fight a god. So I suppose today I finally get to fulfill that wish. He said, as Caliph lifted a single finger in response, gesturing lazily for him to lower his weapon. You are not worthy enough to fight me, child. I could kill you with a blink. His voice remained measured, almost bored. However, you can still serve a purpose. Tell me where Skyshard and his family are, and I will grant you a painless death. The offer hung between them like a blade. Sweat rolled down Su Pei's temple despite the cold wind, because he knew the eternal sovereign spoke the truth. Death would come instantly if Caliph wished it. Yet, despite facing doom, he did not let fear loosen his tongue. I see now where Raymond inherited his delusion, Su Pei replied, forcing a grin through clenched teeth. You called me a true warrior moments ago, and yet you expect me to betray my master for a comfortable death. Ha ha ha, you are a fool, eternal sovereign. A fool who raised a narcissistic son. He jibed, as Caliph's expression darkened. Clench. Tightening his wrist slightly, Caliph exerted an invisible force around Su Pei's throat, as he crushed his windpipe inward as though 1,000 elephants were standing on it. Choke. Su Pei choked, his eyes tearing up, as he struggled to stay conscious. You are far too arrogant for a mortal. Caliph warned, fury beginning to flicker behind his otherwise composed eyes. I will ask you again. Tell me where Skyshard is. And then lead me to where his family resides. Or I will reduce this planet to ash and let their deaths be collateral. His tone shifted now, no longer calm but edged with venom. I know Skyshard is absent from this planet at the moment. If he were here, he would already stand before me. But my sources tell me his family does reside in Ixtal. So if you take me to them, I promise to spare them. For I will bring them to the Eternal Garden as prisoners instead. His gaze sharpened. Refuse, and I will kill them alongside every other ant that crawls across this world. Skyshard killed my son, and for that crime, his bloodline must suffer. Yet I plan to be merciful enough to give him a chance to save them if he can. The pressure tightened slightly, just enough to blur Su Pei's vision. The choice is yours, Commander. Caliph's voice lowered to a whisper that carried more weight than any shout. Total annihilation, or temporary protection. As in that suspended moment between breath and death, Su Pei felt the heaviest dilemma of his life settle upon his shoulders, knowing that either path led to suffering, and that loyalty had never before demanded a price so brutally clear. If he chose to lead them to the Skyshard residence, even if Kaleth did as he said and spared them for now, only torture awaited the Skyshard family in the future. Whereas if he did not, he would sanction them to a certain death at this very moment. My lord, please forgive me. But this is what I would do for my own family if put in this situation. Su Pei thought, as after a few seconds of deliberation, he finally made up his mind and opened his mouth. Fuck. Why you? He said, his voice trembling, as despite Kaleth's tempting offer, he decided to let the Skyshard family die with dignity, rather than letting them be captured as political tools. As Kaleth looked visibly shocked by his decision. Fine, have it your way then, he said, as with a single snap of his fingers, he destroyed Su Pei's body from the inside out. Boom. Su Pei's body burst into fragments of flesh and shattered bone, erupting outward in a violent bloom of crimson mist that scattered across the skies above Ixtal like a grotesque firework, his monarch tier aura collapsing instantly as though it had never existed, leaving behind nothing but drifting embers of dissipating mana that flickered briefly before vanishing into the wind. For a heartbeat, there was silence. No scream, no resistance, no second chance, only the faint rain of blood falling toward the half-rebuilt district below, until Kaleth broke the silence with a deep sigh. Loyal to the end, he murmured without admiration, as he seemed almost disgusted with how loyal Su Pei was to Leo until the very end. Beneath him, panic intensified as the death of a monarch rippled across the planet like a spiritual tremor, as commoners began to say their final goodbyes while crying intensely, fully aware that the last line of meaningful resistance had just been erased. Mortals, Kaleth said with disgust, as he raised both hands toward the heavens and began to gather large amounts of divine essence. Tremble. Soon, space itself began to tremble, a vast distortion forming high above the atmosphere, as clouds spiraled violently inward as if caught in the gravity of a newborn star, while strands of pure, blinding energy gathered between his palms, condensing into a blade-shaped arc of power so immense that even the oceans below began to churn in response. Kaboom! The sky darkened unnaturally. Mana currents across the entire planet reversed direction, funneling upward into the forming construct as continents vibrated under unbearable pressure, cracks beginning to spiderweb faintly across tectonic plates long before the attack had even been released. Seconds passed, and with time the energy only grew. And grew. Yet Kaleth did not swing. Not yet. As suspended between devastation and execution, the eternal sovereign simply gathered more strength, allowing the planet to feel the full weight of what was about to descend upon it, as he relished this moment of revenge. Chapter 10:17 Farewell my lord. Kaleth's paw, the sky above Ixtal. Kaleth continued gathering power until the divine blade above his head expanded outward and stretched across the heavens, swallowing cloud, light, and horizon alike, as only when the arc of condensed force completely blanketed the sky did he finally lower his arm and release it. Good riddance, my old home, he muttered quietly as the attack descended. FWOOSH. The blade fell in a single, absolute line, cleaving through the upper atmosphere first, as it parted through layers of air so violently that the sky itself seemed to fold inward, before detonating outward in a ring of compressed shock that raced around the globe faster than sound itself. Sonic boom. For the briefest fraction of a second, Ixtal remained whole. Then a glowing seam appeared, as a thin white line split the planet from pole to pole, racing across oceans and continents alike, as it sliced through mountain ranges and cityscapes as though they were scratches on fragile glass, before widening under its own unbearable pressure. Crack. The crust did not explode immediately. It bowed. Tectonic plates that had rested in uneasy balance for millennia were forced in opposite directions, the dividing force driving deep into the mantle, as it split the surface and forced the planet's own compressed heat to surge upward in violent response. Boom. Molten rock burst from widening fissures in unstoppable torrents, as oceans heaved into towering walls before flash boiling into expanding clouds of superheated vapor, while entire landmasses folded along failing fault lines before splitting into uneven continental slabs. Thrum. The planet's own gravitational pull weakened as the hemispheres began to drift apart, causing the molten core to rupture through the expanding internal gap and spill outward in blinding arcs of incandescent plasma, as rivers of liquid metal sprayed into open space while the two halves of Ixtal tore away from one another like jaws forced open beyond their limit. Crumble. Finally, it was the atmosphere that fled, as oxygen and vapor were ripped from the surface in violent streams, dragging debris and bodies alike into the void as pressure collapsed so abruptly that those not destroyed in the initial rupture felt their lungs seize and their blood convulse under forces their flesh was never meant to endure. Within moments, the once unified sphere lost all identity as a planet, as it was instead reduced to an expanding storm of scattered rock, cooling magma and drifting dust illuminated faintly by distant starlight, which Caliph gazed down upon with a cold satisfaction in his eyes. A regrettable outcome. However, retribution was inevitable this time, he muttered, before opening a fourth-dimensional portal to return to the Eternal Garden, as he did not linger around to pay his last respects to his old homeland. Moments earlier, Chaosbringer's Pa, Ixtal work office. It had begun as an ordinary day for Chaosbringer, one spent buried beneath reports, resource allocations, and reconstruction updates, when without warning a suffocating pressure descended across the entire planet, pressing down upon Ixtal with such overwhelming authority that he did not need confirmation to understand who had arrived. Caliph. The realization struck instantly, and with it came the quiet certainty that Ixtal did not have long left to exist. I see. I still had so much left to do, he murmured softly, his gaze lingering over the scattered documents across his desk. So much left to teach the next generation, and yet it seems I will not be afforded that luxury. There was no panic in his voice. No denial. Only cruel acceptance. Within a single breath, he reconciled himself with the inevitability of death and shifted his focus from survival to purpose, because if the planet was destined to fall within minutes, then those minutes had to be used wisely. Forgive me, my lord, he added quietly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It appears I will not have the privilege of bidding you farewell in person after all, he said before sweeping all the non-essential documents from his desk in one decisive motion, as he let them scatter across the floor, before pulling the primary data slate closer and navigating swiftly through secured command layers. Tap, 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 enter. Protocol Shadow Servant is now active. Protocol Dead Hand is now active. The confirmations illuminated the screen in steady lettering, as it was only then that Chaosbringer allowed himself a measured exhale, as a quiet sense of relief settled over him. With this, even if I'm gone, the information and administrative network of the cult won't be erased overnight. The Lord, he won't be alone, Chaosbringer muttered, as he opened the front view camera of the data slate and began combing his hair to perfection, as he tried to look his absolute best for the last message he was about to record for the Lord. There was no fear in his eyes, no desperation, only a faint regret of not being able to serve Leo longer, as he spoke with a professionalism befitting the number 2 man of the cult. My lord, by the time this message reaches you, if it reaches you at all, I would be long gone, he began, as he stood before the camera with his back straight. Despite the crushing pressure shaking the foundations of the building around him, the planet of Ixtal is currently under attack by the Eternal Sovereign Caliph. And it is my assumption that by now the surface has already fractured beyond recovery, and that within minutes the planet will cease to exist as a celestial body, he informed, as he let out a brief sigh. Unfortunately, it seems like I failed to predict this outcome in advance, and hence have not prepared adequate countermeasures for it, and as a result, it pains me to inform you that I have failed to prevent Ixtal's destruction, he said, as a faint tremor ran through the walls and dust began to drift from the ceiling above. My lord, I implore you, when you see this message, do not allow your rageful nature to seize control. Think about this situation pragmatically, as the bosses of the uprising guild once would. Do not charge blindly toward vengeance, but rather, calculate, prepare, win, he said, as he adjusted his collar lightly, maintaining composure even while the office lighting flickered under the strain. I have followed you faithfully for my entire life and never once asked for anything in return, because for me, serving under you was the greatest honor my existence could amount to. However, as you rose to the position of cult master and began approaching the upper echelons of universal power, I gradually came to understand that I alone was not enough to be the administrator you truly required, he said, as a faint, almost self-aware smile tugged at the corner of his lips. I was a mortal, a weakling compared to the forces you now contend with. And we both knew that my death was inevitable sooner or later, whether by age or by war. Therefore, when you see this message, do not mourn me. Instead, be happy that I died while still in my prime, with my mind intact, and while I was still serving you until my final breath, exactly as I wished, he said, as the ground beneath him rumbled violently and cracks began to crawl across the reinforced flooring. In my stead, I leave behind a cadre of 13 operative shadows. 1 through 13. Each has been personally trained by me in governance, logistics, intelligence, finance, diplomacy, and crisis management. Individually, none surpass me. However, collectively, they exceed my capabilities many times over. Use them well, my lord, and they will ensure that the cult's administrative and political backbone remains unbroken, he said, as he steadied the data slate with one hand while fragments of plaster fell from above. I suppose this is it, he said, as a large section of the ceiling collapsed in the distance and a wave of dust rolled through the room. It has been a privilege to serve you. If there is a next life, I hope to be born in your service once again. And if there is none, then perhaps we shall meet in a place far kinder than the one we are currently leaving behind. However, this life or the next, if there is a higher power, then my only wish is to be by your side again, in whatever capacity destiny chooses me to place me in, he said, as the walls around him began to buckle under unbearable strain. Until then, this is Chaosbringer signing out. So farewell, my lord. Please take care of yourself on my behalf, for I will no longer be able to, he said, as the upload bar reached completion and the transmission locked, while the structure around him gave way to collapsing steel and stone, the room around him imploding inwards as he was buried under tons of concrete and steel, and given an instant death. Chapter 1018 No Home to Return to. Meanwhile, Planet V Star, Leo's POV. FWOOSH. The fourth dimension folded back into stillness as Leo stepped out of the dimensional portal and back into the quiet clearing before the hut, his aura settling unevenly around him as the strain of another fruitless session lingered in his nerves. The projection of the timeless assassin stood waiting exactly where he always did, hands clasped behind his back as though not a single second had passed. No progress, Leo said, as he met the projection's eyes without pretense, the frustration in his tone restrained but unmistakable. I still can't feel the slope of it. It's like I'm staring at a wall and pretending it's a horizon. The projection nodded slowly, neither disappointed nor surprised. It is not easy to sense the gradient of time, he said, as he studied Leo with calm detachment. What you are attempting to grasp is not movement, but deviation. Not speed, but distortion. Progress will come one day or another. Leo let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh. Yeah, he said, as he scratched the back of his head and tilted it slightly to one side. But that day would come a lot sooner if you let me train more than 1 hour a day. The projection's expression did not change, though there was the faintest narrowing of his eyes. Childish impatience, he said, as he folded his arms across his chest. Do you really believe repetition alone will force comprehension? He asked, as Leo snorted in response. It's worked for me up till now. It worked when I was learning dagger skills. It worked for mana control. It worked for every other skill I've ever learned. So yeah, I think it will work, he said, as the projection shook his head once. Time is not a blade to be swung until it obeys you, he said, as his voice remained steady and unyielding. If you drown your mind in it for too long, you will only distort your perception further. So remember, cultivating patience is also a form of training, he advised, as Leo clicked his tongue softly. Great, he said, as he ran a hand through his hair. So now I'm training by not training. And you're back to your default settings where your words make no fucking sense to me. Yeah, whatever, the projection replied, as he turned slightly toward the hut, signaling the end of the session without ceremony. Complain all you want, but I'm not changing my mind. I'll see you again tomorrow, he said, as Leo stared at his back for a moment, knowing better than to argue further, as despite his frustration he understood that the old assassin had never once misled him in matters of cultivation. Fine, Leo muttered, as he straightened and let his aura settle completely. Same time tomorrow. Same time tomorrow, the projection said, as his form began to fade subtly at the edges. Return only when your mind is clear. Leo gave a small nod before turning away, unaware that far from this quiet planet, he no longer had a home to return to. A few minutes later, the space that used to be Ixtal. After his regular training session, Leo returned to the location he thought was Ixtal via the fourth dimension, as upon re-emergence, the scenery that unfolded before him was unlike anything that he could have ever expected in his wildest dreams. For a moment, he genuinely wondered if he had made a mistake while traveling through the fourth dimension. Whether he had miscalculated the trajectory of his tunnel and teleported to a random part of the universe. However, the amount of rocks and debris floating around him painted a different picture. He muttered in disbelief, as the words felt foreign even to his own ears. All around him, instead of the blue and green sphere that had once floated proudly in this stretch of space, there was only ruin, an expanding halo of shattered continental fragments, drifting magma clots, and pulverized stone reflecting distant starlight in dull, dying embers. For a few heartbeats, his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't Ixtal. It couldn't be. He turned slowly in place, as if expecting the planet to reappear behind him, as though this were some elaborate illusion or spatial mirage created by a distortion in the fourth dimension. I must have misaligned the exit vector, he murmured, as he closed one eye and extended his perception outward, scanning for familiar mana signatures. However, much to his shock, there were none. No planetary mana core, no defensive arrays, no atmospheric pulse, only debris. Cold, silent, his breathing shallowed as fragments of what had once been. Mountains drifted past him like broken teeth, as a slab of crust the size of a city rotated slowly through the void, still glowing faintly along one edge where molten rock bled into space. No. The word left him before he consciously chose to say it. His heart began to pound violently against his ribs as disbelief gave way to something far darker, as his mind raced to construct alternative explanations, a planetary displacement spell, an illusion array, a dimensional overlay, anything but the obvious. Then he felt it, a faint, fading residue of divine essence lingering in the vacuum. Caliph. The realization did not arrive all at once. It seeped into him like poison. His aura flickered erratically as the vacuum around him trembled in response to the surge of unstable emotion, as his perception fractured between denial and understanding. This isn't real, he whispered, as he reached out instinctively toward where the planetary core should have been, grasping at empty space. The silence of the void pressed in on him. No heartbeat of a world. No distant hum of civilization. No laughter of his children. Only absence. As for the first time in a long while, Leo felt something inside him begin to crack, as reality itself seemed unreliable, as the universe no longer obeyed the rules he had believed in, and as the quiet certainty that he had left home for just 1 hour, began to spiral into a suffocating question. Did this really happen because I went away for 1 hour? He wondered, as Amanda's words from a couple days ago started to ring heavy in his mind. Chapter 10:19 Destined to Walk Alone. Surrounded by the ruins of Ixtal, Leo's POV. Did this really happen because I went away for a single hour? Leo couldn't help but wonder, as his mind raced back to the argument he had with Amanda a few days ago, where she had asked him as to why he could not simply stay home for a few years, instead of chasing distant threats across the universe. He remembered how calmly he had answered her then, as he explained that he could not remain home all the time because dangers did not wait politely at the doorstep, and because someone had to look beyond the horizon to ensure that the horizon itself remained safe. And yet because of that very decision, because he had chosen vigilance over presence, he now no longer had a home to return to, no longer a family waiting behind its doors, and no longer a cult capital where he could pretend to be a leader instead of a man who had just lost everything. Amanda, baby, where are you? He muttered, as he turned slowly amidst the drifting ruins, scanning the endless debris field with desperate eyes while wondering which fragment of shattered stone might conceal what remained of her body. As slowly but surely, his perception expanded across a wide area of the broken expanse, his senses searching for the faintest biological residue or spiritual imprint, as the realization struck him with merciless clarity that there might not even be a body left to find. Gulp. Leo gulped nervously, as the thought settled into him like ice. He suddenly realized that let alone seeing her for a last time, he might never even be able to give her a proper burial, as there was a chance that the woman who had shared his bed, his burdens, and his children had likely been reduced to nothing more than scattered atoms lost in vacuum. Caleb, where are you? Myron, he shouted into the empty space in front, as his voice carried uselessly through space while his thoughts drifted helplessly to his children's smiles, to Caleb's stumbling steps and to Myron's bright, innocent laughter. So young, they were so young, so innocent. He muttered, as tears streamed freely down his face while something inside him began to splinter beyond repair, as the image of their small hands reaching for him clashed violently against the emptiness before his eyes. Guilt began coiling around his heart, as he could not stop himself from wondering whether this was karma for killing Raymond in a moment of rage, as he could not help but question whether his own immaturity in provoking enemies beyond his scale had brought this annihilation down upon his family. Myron, please come back, he whispered brokenly, as his shoulders trembled in open space while the debris field rotated silently around him. I'll see the painting you made. I'll even sit down and paint with you, just come back to me, son. He begged, as grief unlike anything he had ever known tore through him completely, leaving behind a hollowed shell of a man who no longer knew whether he was a protector or the very curse that destroyed everything he touched. Was it painful? Did they scream for me as they died? He wondered, as despite Monarch's indifference trying its best to stabilize his emotions, Leo somehow felt the skill fail completely, as rage and grief flooded him like never before. Images of how Ixtal must have suffered in its final moments overtook his mind without mercy, as he pictured the sky splitting above the capital and the ground fracturing beneath familiar streets while panic tore through the crowds below. He imagined Amanda grabbing the children instinctively as buildings crumbled and as the air itself began to tear apart around them, her eyes scanning the heavens for him while the impossible descended. Without warning, "Father!" Caleb's voice echoed in his thoughts, stubborn and brave even in fear, as he imagined his son shouting for him to fix it like he always did while the world around him disintegrated beyond saving. While he imagined Myron clinging desperately to his mother, terror evident in his innocent eyes, as the planet before him trembled and the horizon itself split in two. Shiver. Choke. A violent shiver ran down Leo's spine as the imagined scene grew clearer inside his head instead of fading, his aura pulsing erratically outward as fragments of debris nearby cracked and splintered under the pressure of his spiraling instability. Pant. Pant. His breathing grew uneven and shallow as he forced himself to consider the possibility that his family might have remained conscious for several horrifying seconds, long enough to understand what was happening and long enough to search for him in those final, desperate heartbeats. The thought that they might have called his name while the sky burned above them struck him harder than the destruction itself, as guilt coiled tightly around his chest until even the silent void felt suffocating. I'm a failure. I failed as a husband, a father, and a cult master. Leo muttered, as Monarch's indifference flickered within him like a failing lantern in a storm, as the technique that had once numbed him to massacre and bloodshed proved powerless before the image of his own children dying without him. Tremble. His hands trembled uncontrollably as tears drifted away in weightless droplets, his mind spiraling further as the line between reality and imagination blurred into something equally unbearable. What good is all the training in the universe? What good will come of me becoming a god, even if I achieve the pinnacle anymore? Without my family to protect, is reaching the pinnacle even worth striving for? He could not help but wonder, as for the first time in his life, he realized without a shadow of a doubt as to how important his family was for him. As although he always knew that his family was one of his biggest motivations to grow stronger, it wasn't until today, until he lost it all, that he realized just how important they really were, and how lost in life he would be without them. In the end, you're destined to walk alone. The words echoed in his head, as he was reminded of a warning he heard long ago. A warning that had long since informed him that if he continued to go down the path he was on, that sooner or later, he was bound to walk alone. Chapter 1020 Mental Spiral. Surrounded by the ruins of Ixtal, Leo's POV. An hour passed in an absent-minded haze for Leo, as for a good 60 minutes he simply stood in the empty of space while shattered continents and rapidly cooling magma drifted slowly around him. I'll find something, even a fragment, Leo said, as he forced his senses to sweep across rotating slabs of crust while refusing to accept that he could no longer find traces of his family, no matter how hard he tried. If I could not save them, then I should at least bury them, he muttered, as each fragment he examined revealed only stone and frozen magma as no trace of Amanda's mana signature remained, while the void answered him with an indifference that felt crueler than violence. Keep looking. You just missed it, Leo thought, as he expanded his range further despite already knowing that he had combed the same sector 3 times over. Shine. The debris field glimmered faintly beneath distant stars as metallic shards and pulverized cities rotated without pattern, while the silence pressed so heavily on him that even his own heartbeat felt intrusive. Don't stop. Not yet, Leo said, as his jaw tightened and as his eyes burned from tears that drifted away in weightless droplets. As it was at this moment, that his lungs finally began to ache without his permission as the lack of oxygen finally triggered the alarm center in his brain, while instinct started clawing through the grief with mechanical urgency. I'll black out if I don't find oxygen soon, Leo thought, as his vision flickered faintly at the edges while survival systems activated regardless of emotional collapse. Choke. He inhaled reflexively, as though the planet around him still held air. However, unfortunately for him, there was nothing to inhale in this vacuum, as his lungs refused to expand. Fine, fine, I'll move, Leo said, as he wiped his face with the back of his hand while still hovering among the ruins like a ghost unwilling to depart. He tried to think of a destination to move to next. However, unfortunately for him, choosing a destination felt impossible as every coordinate that surfaced in his mind collapsed under the realization that none of them held his family anymore, while even the thought of the cult fleet summoned only images of Chaosbringer, who was now likely gone. Where do I go from here? Leo said, as he stared at his trembling palms while the question felt smaller than the universe yet heavier than gravity. There's nowhere left, nowhere to call home, Leo thought, as the truth slid into him slowly, that there would be no Skyshard residence for him to return to, no matter which planet he made into his new home. For another 5 minutes, he drifted aimlessly, as indecision rooted him in place. As it wasn't until his vision doubled again and his heartbeat grew erratic beneath the strain of oxygen deprivation, that he finally snapped out of his daze. I have to live on, but for what? Leo said, as the words left him hollow while the void offered no answer. FWOOSH. Muscle memory guided his hand as he tore open a fourth-dimensional portal toward planet Yamuna, one of the two recently captured cult worlds, while the act felt automatic rather than intentional. He stepped into the tunnel without focus as the geometry of the fourth dimension twisted around him in shifting angles, while he navigated more from instinct than precision because grief blurred the calculations he normally executed flawlessly. I don't even care where this leads, Leo thought, as he drifted through warped space while the destination barely registered in his awareness. However, thankfully for him, he did manage to emerge onto Yamuna's surface unharmed, as air struck his lungs violently, while gravity pulled him downward with sudden, almost insulting normalcy. Gasp! He inhaled sharply as oxygen flooded his bloodstream, while the breath tasted painfully ordinary compared to the magnitude of what had been lost. Thud! His knees gave out beneath him almost instantly, as strength abandoned him without warning, while he collapsed face first into the soil and made no effort to rise. I will avenge them, that much I will, Leo said, as the vow formed automatically while his cheek pressed against the ground. But what does revenge even give me? Leo thought, as the question cut deeper than rage while the emptiness inside him refused to be filled by the idea of Caleth's death. No amount of power will bring them back, Leo said, as he clenched his fists into the dirt while the thought scraped against every ambition he had ever held. If there's no one waiting for me, what am I even building toward? Leo thought, as the sky above Yamuna blurred in his vision while the idea of reaching the pinnacle suddenly felt meaningless. For a while, he lay there motionless, as the minutes passed slowly. Until eventually, he started to rise back up again, only to fall back down, as at this moment, he did not resemble the cult master of the cult of ascension at all, but rather a broken man, who no longer knew whether living was duty or punishment. I'm a failure. I'm a fucking failure and a disgrace. Leo muttered, as his fingers dug into the soil beneath him while his shoulders shook violently under the weight of words he had just uttered. I was supposed to protect you. Leo continued, as his voice cracked while his nails carved shallow grooves into the dirt as though he could bury the confession there instead of carrying it forward. I chased power. I chased enemies. I chased pride. And look where it got me. Leo thought, as the internal admission sounded harsher than any opponent he had ever faced on a battlefield. His breathing turned ragged again as tears mixed with soil beneath his cheek, while the image of Myron holding up a painting for his approval stabbed through him with unbearable clarity. I chose the horizon over you, Leo said, as the realization settled into him fully while there was no one left to deny it. I was never protecting them. I was just trying to prove something to myself. Leo thought, as the truth settled into him with a cold finality that no enemy's blade had ever managed to deliver. Above him, Yamuna's sky stretched vast and indifferent, as it remained unchanged while he broke beneath it. I took everything for granted, and now I've lost it all, he muttered, trembling, as strongest monarch, cult master, demon of Omega, and every other title he carried felt hollow and weightless. As he realized that at this moment, he was not a rising god, but rather just a broken man crushed by the consequences of his own path. Chapter 1021 Leo was right all along. Meanwhile, within the time-stilled world, Amanda's POV. Childish cackle. Innocent running. Laughter echoed through the skyshard city bazaar as Caleb sprinted ahead with a wooden glider clutched tightly in his hands, while Myron chased after him with a stuffed mechanical beast that roared whenever its tail was pressed. Amanda followed behind them with an indulgent smile that softened the stern composure she usually carried, as for once she allowed herself to simply be their mother instead of the cult leader's wife. For now, they all remained completely unaware of what had transpired beyond this sealed dimension, as they enjoyed their shopping trip with gentle satisfaction. I really like these sets of silk robes for Leo. What do you think, Dumpy? Amanda asked, as she ran her fingers along the stitching slowly, while imaging how handsome Leo would look putting them on. As long as it's black, Lord Father will wear it. Dumpy replied nonchalantly, as his words caused Caleb to pause for once. Do you think Papa will like this because it's black? Caleb asked, as he tugged at Amanda's sleeve with wide eyes. He'll pretend he doesn't, Amanda replied, as she adjusted the folded robe in her arms while warmth filled her voice. But he will, she said, as listening to their idle exchange, it was Dumpy who eventually grew impatient first. Now that the gift has been bought, we should depart immediately, Dumpy demanded, as his webbed fingers drummed against the side of the shopping bag while his golden eyes remained sharp despite the peaceful surroundings. Dumpy, Amanda replied lightly, as she raised an eyebrow at him. You do know that although it's been an hour and a half in here, only a minute has passed outside, yes? While that is true, Dumpy responded without hesitation. It required 2.5 hours to travel from Ixtal to this dimension, as it will require another 2.5 hours to return. Lord Father will be kept waiting for 5 hours in total, which for me personally is unacceptable," he said, as his calculation ended the debate. Within minutes, the children were ushered back aboard the craft as the landing gear was retracted, and the craft was prepared for departure. THRUMM. The engines hummed steadily as it began its return toward Ixtal, unaware that it was flying toward absence instead of home. For the first hour and a half of the journey, the cabin was filled with life as Caleb tested the glider's mechanisms while Myron insisted Dumpy play the villain in an elaborate rescue scenario. The frog endured repeated dramatic defeats with visible annoyance, as Amanda watched with tired amusement while the sound of her children's laughter filled the narrow corridors. Eventually, Amanda enforced order. "All right kids, it's time for your nap," she said firmly, as she guided the boys toward their quarters despite protests that gradually softened into drowsy compliance. "I never understood why humans require so much sleep," Dumpy remarked from the doorway, as he folded his arms with mild disdain. "Frogs can remain awake for days without issue." Amanda shot him a look heavy with envy before shaking her head. "Lucky you." Silence gradually settled over the craft as the children drifted off, their breathing evening into soft rhythm, as Amanda eventually retreated to the viewing deck, where stars stretched endlessly before her as another quiet hour slipped by unnoticed. Sirens blaring, red lights flickering. Suddenly, it was the sound of alarms that shattered the calm, as both Dumpy and Amanda rushed towards the captain's cabin instantly to see what went wrong. "What's wrong, Captain? Are we being pursued?" Dumpy demanded as he entered the command deck, his tone sharp and controlled. The captain shook his head slowly, confusion lining his face. "No enemy signatures," he reported, as his hands hovered uncertainly over the console. "However, we are experiencing critical navigational discrepancies. According to our trajectory, planet Ixtal should be directly ahead, yet our systems detect no planetary mass. Only a dense asteroid field." The words lingered in the air as the craft advanced cautiously. Forward. Fragmented rock began to fill the forward viewport, as massive slabs of crust rotated slowly in the vacuum where a world should have stood. Dumpy's eyes narrowed slightly, as comprehension settled into him before it reached anyone else. "That is not an asteroid field," Dumpy said coldly, as his gaze remained fixed on the drifting debris. "Your systems have not failed. Ixtal has." The cabin fell into absolute silence. Amanda stared at the shattered remains of what had once been her home as comprehension refused to settle inside her mind. For a while, she tried to reject Dumpy's theory, as she hoped that it was indeed a systems failure that caused this issue. However, when she finally saw a floating house with blood splattered on its door outside the viewport, there was no denying the reality. "Anymore. No," she whispered faintly, as her vision blurred while the scale of the destruction began to press inward from all sides. The red warning lights reflected off fragments of broken continents outside, as the sight became too large for her thoughts to contain. Wobble. Her knees buckled suddenly as gravity felt unreliable beneath her, as Dumpy moved quickly to catch her before she struck the floor. "Hold yourself, Lady Mother," Dumpy instructed, as his voice remained steady though his eyes had turned far colder than before. "This is not a time for weakness," he admonished. "It is unlikely Lord Father has been vanquished," he continued evenly, as strategy already began replacing sentiment within him. "However, if he has, we must prepare accordingly. There are children aboard, and weakness is not a luxury we can afford," he said. However, Amanda barely heard him, as her thoughts spiraled elsewhere. "Leo," she murmured faintly, as her fingers trembled against Dumpy's sleeve while her gaze remained locked on the drifting ruins beyond. The glass. Leo was right. Ixtal really was under imminent danger. "What have I done? Oh Lord, what have I done?" Chapter 1022 My Loyal Friend. Near the ruins of Ixtal, Amanda's POV. It was only when she truly looked at the shattered remains of Ixtal that Amanda finally understood why Leo could never simply stay home, as she began to grasp why he carried that relentless drive to grow stronger, because if he did not, then everything they built could be erased in an instant just like this. "Leo, are you okay?" she muttered in a broken voice, as the mere thought that he might have been caught in the destruction sent a wave of cold dread through her chest. Unlike Dumpy, she was not fully convinced that Leo had survived. However, for the sake of her own fragile composure, she forced herself to believe that he was still alive somewhere out there. Breathing, fighting, enduring, because the alternative was something she simply could not bear to accept. "I promise I'll never stop you from training ever again if you're alive. I promise I will never be difficult again. Nor will I ask more of you. You can work towards protecting our kids, while I will nurture them. Just be safe." She prayed, as in a single instant, all the complaints, all the resentment she held towards Leo for being an absent father vanished, and was instead replaced by a begrudging acceptance that Leo had been right all along. I was wrong. I see it now. Please don't let our story end like this. I promise, I'll make it up to you. She muttered, as she began to shiver uncontrollably, her body temperature rising rapidly, as she developed an instantaneous fever. Meanwhile Dumpy. For a moment, Dumpy could not hide the disgust he felt for Amanda at all, as on more than one instance, he struggled to suppress his urge to knock her out cold. Woman, you have 2 children to look after. Can you be less pathetic? He wondered, as if there was one thing he hated more than display of emotions, it was display of weakness which Amanda put on before him now. The planet is destroyed, we have no idea if the enemy is still around or already gone, where is your common sense? He wondered, as he could not help but clench and unclench his fists non-stop. Should I just drop her and be on my way? Seriously, I wonder what Lord Father sees in this woman. If not for my respect for him, I'd have thrown her out of the exit hatch by now. He thought, as he felt his body convulse with repulsion as he held her trembling form. Fuck it. I'm going to go look after Lord Father's kids if this woman won't. Dumpy concluded in the end, as he gently lowered Amanda's trembling body to the floor, before walking away as though she did not even exist. Meanwhile, Leo, planet Yamuna. While Amanda and Dumpy floated near the ruins of Ixtal, Leo continued to sit aimlessly on the soil of Yamuna, as he struggled to regain clarity of his thoughts. Step. From a long distance away, Leo sensed the approach of a transcendent tier warrior, and hence, out of instinct alone, he threw a dagger towards the stranger. Swoosh. The dagger sailed past the stranger's face, leaving behind a thin cut, as Leo spoke without glancing towards his target. Go away, today is not a good day. And if you dare take another step forward, I will have no choice but to kill you, Leo warned, as the stranger stopped abruptly, before dropping to one knee, as he spoke at the top of his lungs. Cult Master. I am number 7, a shadow operative nurtured and raised by Lord Chaosbringer. And it is my duty to reach out to you in these troubling times. The operative said, as listening to his words, Leo finally spared him a glance, only to be surprised by what he saw. The operative was unlike any warrior Leo had seen before, as his body bore clear fox-human traits, with pointed ears atop his head and a long white tail resting behind him. His fur was completely white, as was his hair, brows, and lashes, while his skin carried a pale tone consistent with albinism. Even his eyes were unusual, with light crimson irises that stood out sharply against his otherwise colorless features. There were no visible scars or signs of battle wear on him, as his posture remained disciplined and controlled while he knelt. However, what drew Leo's attention most was not his appearance, but his gaze. His eyes were steady, alert, and observant, reflecting a level of intelligence that was immediately noticeable. There was no panic in him despite Leo's threat, only awareness and calculation, as it became clear to Leo that this was a man with an exceptionally high IQ, who was trained for analysis rather than brute combat. Where is Chaosbringer? Leo asked, his question straight and direct, as if possible, he did not wish to deal with Chaosbringer's underlings, but rather the man himself. However, just as he already anticipated, the fox-human only lowered his head in response to this question, as he curled his tail tightly against his body. Forgive me, Cult Master. But the fact that the 13 program was activated before schedule likely means that Lord Chaosbringer is already dead. He answered, as he lowered his gaze. For the past 2 decades, he has been grooming 13 of us to eventually replace him as your number 2 man. However, we were still midway through the program and there was no clear successor pointed out yet. Ideally, the program was to last another decade, however, there was a contingency added to it, where the program went live immediately, should Lord Chaosbringer ever face untimely demise. Number 7 explained, as Leo let out the most labored sigh he had ever let out in his life. Sigh. Chaosbringer. My loyal friend. He muttered in an emotional tone, as for the first time in his life, he shed a tear for a subordinate. A subordinate, who he knew he could never replace ever again. Chapter 1023 Contingency Plan. Planet Yamuna, Leo's POV. It took several long moments for Leo to steady himself, as he slowly rose to his feet while forcing his breathing to even out and his voice to stop trembling. I'm assuming Chaosbringer left a contingency plan for me to follow as well, in case he ever died unexpectedly. Leo said, as he kept his tone level despite the fatigue weighing behind it, while number 7 lowered his head in confirmation. He did, Cult Master. If you would follow me, I will debrief you aboard the cult ship. 7 replied calmly, as his posture remained respectful yet composed. Leo exhaled through his nose and blinked once, pushing aside the lingering haze clouding his thoughts. Lead the way, he instructed quietly, as 7 turned without hesitation and began walking, while Leo followed a step behind. Soon, the duo boarded a cult destroyer-class vessel that Leo had never seen before, as its structure immediately felt different from the warships he was accustomed to commanding. There were no visible troop bays or heavy cargo holds along its internal layout, as the corridors instead led toward reinforced data cores and secured archival chambers, making it clear that this was not a combat carrier but a doomsday-grade preservation ship designed to safeguard information arrays and critical blueprints above all else. Please enter your biometrics here, Cult Master. Once you do, the doomsday message that Lord Chaosbringer sent you should be visible as a hologram. Till then, I will wait outside and give you some privacy. Agent 7 said, as he led Leo to a message reading room, where 3 blinking dots appeared on the screen to suggest that Chaosbringer had uploaded 3 doomsday messages before passing away. Very well, you may wait outside, Leo acknowledged, as he pressed his fingerprints on the digital scanner ahead, which immediately prompted the message to load. Before him, FWOOSH. The hologram flickered once before stabilizing, as Chaosbringer's familiar figure stood upright before Leo, immaculate as always despite the faint tremor in the recorded background. My lord, if you are viewing this message, it means that I am likely already dead, and that one of the cult's most important planets, either the time-stilled world or Ixtal, has been destroyed completely. While not ideal, do not worry, for I have already planned for such a scenario and devised 2 emergency protocols to handle them correctly. He spoke calmly, as though briefing Leo before a routine campaign rather than from the edge of annihilation. The first protocol is meant for me to be replaced by a competent group of underlings, which I call the Shadow Servant Protocol. Over the past 2 decades, I have secretly trained 13 extremely talented individuals to become your servants, and as an extra precaution, I have ensured that none of these 13 are normal humans, and that all of them are beast humans whose identities are difficult to falsify and whose individual traits differ greatly from one another. They each specialize in separate fields, and if used correctly, they can become the pillar of the cult's administrative department in the future. Whether it is political assassination, diplomacy, complex project execution, or simple day-to-day assistance, they will be able to support you in all matters. With them beside you, I hope you will not feel my absence too heavily, and that though none of them equal me individually, together, they will be able to fill the gap I leave behind. Chaosbringer briefed, as the first indicator on the console dimmed, and the second segment began automatically. The second protocol I have activated is called the Dead Hand Protocol. His tone hardened slightly. This will trigger a series of retaliatory strikes across the universe, meant to ensure that our enemies never gain a narrative upper hand. And ensure that our populace doesn't get demoralized or think that we have become toothless. Over the past 5 years, I have instructed our agents to plant high-grade explosives in numerous key cities and strategic planets. And exactly 24 hours after this protocol activates, simultaneous detonations will occur across the universe. Those who harm the cult will never again enjoy narrative superiority or peaceful nights. As whether it be the Mu clan, the Du clan, the other great clans, or even the universal government, there will not be a single power untouched under the Dead Hand Protocol, as we will hit them all. If a single one of our core worlds burn, so too shall theirs. However, to drive the point home, alongside the explosions, a message will also be circulated on the Galaxy Net, declaring that any attack on cult citizens will be avenged 100-fold. The message will be phrased in a way that instigates maximum panic, as it will make the righteous citizens believe that we have infiltrated all their institutions, and that none of them are safe from our wrath anymore. The goal is to make the righteous faction believe that this is a new era of cult leadership under you. And that, under this new era, the cult doesn't strike just once a decade, or once a century, but rather strikes aggressively and without fear of retaliation, which makes us dangerous to provoke. The second indicator blinked out. A final holographic file loaded. Chaosbringer stood closer to the projection lens this time, as the background behind him shook faintly. My lord, if this message reaches you at all, then it means I have likely fallen. Please do not be enraged at my loss or seek to avenge me rashly. That is not my wish. It was the greatest honor of my life to serve you, and if destiny allows, I would gladly do it all again. Until then, this is Chaosbringer signing off. Chaosbringer said, as the hologram dissolved slowly into light, and silence filled the room once more. Leo remained motionless for several long seconds, as the weight of strategy and farewell pressed against him simultaneously. Chaosbringer. He muttered quietly, as grief tightened in his chest once more. In my darkest hours, it was my honor to have you by my side, my friend. His jaw clenched as he stared at the empty air where the projection had stood. Hopefully, we will meet again someday. Chapter 1024 Still alive. Meanwhile aboard Amanda's ship, while Leo was being escorted to the doomsday vessel on planet Yamuna, the captain of Amanda's ship transmitted an SOS signal across all active cult frequencies, only to receive a response from Yamuna's central command instructing them to divert and land immediately. This is planet Yamuna's central command speaking. If your vessel is in distress, you are cleared to land safely on our planet. Yamuna is currently secure. The message came through clearly, as the captain adjusted their trajectory without hesitation, charting a direct course toward Yamuna with an estimated arrival time of 12 hours. Meanwhile, Kalith's POV. After destroying Ixtal, Kalith returned to the Eternal Garden with a quiet, triumphant smile, as exhilaration coursed through him at having taken the first decisive step toward avenging his son. You took away my family, so now I've taken away yours. Let's see how you handle this setback, Leo Skyshard, because that will tell me exactly what kind of man you are. Kalith murmured thoughtfully, as his fingers brushed against his chin in idle contemplation. The way I see it, you now have 3 possible paths. First, you can march to the Eternal Garden in blind rage and challenge me directly, which will only result in your pointless death. Second, you can attempt to bide your time and build your strength. However, without access to the materials required to craft a demigod ascension potion, you will never cross that threshold and your patience will only be wasted. Or third, you can swallow this loss like poison and live with its bitterness for the rest of your life. He paused briefly, as the smile on his face deepened. Regardless of which path you choose, in the end, it will be me who stands victorious, and you who suffers. I never wished to start this war. A monarch such as yourself would never have caught my attention. But you killed my son. So this is personal now. He said, as he cast one final glance toward Raymond's grave before turning away, as calm satisfaction settled over him once more. A few minutes later, Leo's paw, planet Yamuna. Not long after watching Chaosbringer's message, as Leo sat down inside the doomsday vessel contemplating his next move, he was interrupted by Agent 7, who had some extremely urgent and important news to deliver him. Cult Master, there seems to be an urgent message for you from Central Command. I apologize for the interruption, however, it is my understanding that you would want to pick up this call. Agent 7 said, as Leo raised a confused eyebrow at his words. What is it? If it's something related to governance, then I'm really not in the mood today. Leo said, as Agent 7 bowed lower, his fox tail wagging behind him, as he said, Cult Master, it seems like Lord Big Green is on the other side of a live call. He wishes to connect to you at once. 7 informed, as Leo immediately shot up to his feet in surprise. Dumpy. He's alive, Leo asked in shock, as he rushed to accept the call, which connected over a transmission orb. Click. Leo saw a frowning face of Dumpy on the other side of the line, as the frog did not seem amused at all to see Leo based on his expression. Dumpy, you're alive, Leo muttered emotionally, his eyes widening in delight, as although he never explicitly said it, he was in fact extremely fond of Dumpy, who he treated no differently than his own children. Of course I'm alive, Lord Father. There's not a beast in this universe that's strong enough to take me down. However, that's not what's important right now. Dumpy began, as he rotated the transmission orb to display the image of a crying Amanda sitting beside extremely concerned children. This woman, your wife, has been crying non-stop since we flew over Ixtal, not ready to believe that you're most likely okay. I told her, it's impossible that Lord Father can be vanquished so simply in battle. But no, she's been sobbing her eyes out. And I literally can't handle her sound anymore. So please, I beg you Lord Father, make her stop. Because if I listen to her cries for another half a minute, I might genuinely go insane, Dumpy said, as for a moment, Leo felt his heart skip a beat at the sight of Amanda and the kids. Mom, why are you crying? Please don't cry, Mom. We'll be good kids from now on. We love you, the kids said, as they hugged and tried to console Amanda, as watching them all alive and well, Leo felt something inside him snap. Amanda, Caleb, Myron, you're alive, Leo muttered, as the words left his lips barely above a whisper while his throat tightened so violently that it felt as though he had swallowed broken glass. For a moment he simply stared at the projection, as his mind refused to process what his eyes were clearly seeing, because only minutes ago he had buried them in his thoughts, had mourned them, had convinced himself that he was alone in the universe. However, now that they stood before him alive, his breathing turned ragged while the crushing weight that had been pressing against his ribs suddenly gave way, replaced instead by a surge of relief so overwhelming that his knees nearly buckled beneath him. I wasn't too late, Leo thought, as disbelief collided with relief while the image of Amanda's tear-streaked face and the boys clinging to her rewrote the reality he had accepted. Caleb lifted his head at the sound of Leo's voice, as his eyes widened, before brightening instantly. Papa. Myron's small hands pressed harder against Amanda's arm as he leaned toward the projection, as if trying to climb through it. Leo's vision blurred as tears welled again, however this time they did not burn with grief but flooded him with a fierce, protective warmth that made his heartbeat thunder. I still have them. The thought hit him like a tidal wave, as gratitude, relief, guilt, love, and fierce resolve surged through him all at once, threatening to break him in a completely different way. He did not smile. He could not. But for the first time since Ixtal fell, he felt something stronger than despair take root inside his chest. As he felt hope burn bright in his chest. Chapter 1025 Never Again. For a while, Leo wondered if he was dreaming. If this was some elaborate illusion crafted by Caleth or Morris, designed to offer him hope only so it could be ripped away again at the cruelest possible moment. However, the longer the transmission remained stable, and the more he watched Amanda's shoulders tremble as she cried without restraint, the more certain he became that this was no fabrication. Amanda, he called weakly at first, his voice rough from everything it had endured. However, as though disgusted by how his own voice sounded, he straightened instantly and steadied his breath. Amanda, he called again, this time calm and firm, as his expression hardened and he forced himself to look composed, to appear as the pillar she needed rather than the broken man he had been only minutes ago. Amanda froze at the sound of his voice, her tear-filled eyes lifting slowly towards the communication orb. Beside her, Dumpy frowned deeply, clearly irritated by the continued sobbing, as without ceremony, he thrust the orb into Amanda's trembling hands. Get your shit together, woman. He snapped bluntly before turning and storming off, leaving her alone with the image projected before her. Amanda cradled the orb carefully, as if it were the most fragile treasure in existence, her fingers curling around it protectively while she stared at Leo as though she were seeing him for the first time. Why, you're alive, she asked softly, her face attempting to form a smile even as tears streamed freely down her cheeks. Leo nodded once. Of course I'm alive. I would never leave you alone in this cruel universe, he replied steadily. As at those words, Amanda broke into uneven, breathless laughter that dissolved immediately into more tears, her emotions too tangled to separate relief from disbelief. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at one another through the projection, as Caleb and Myron hovered uncertainly around their mother, tugging at her sleeves and glancing between her and the orb. In those quiet moments, something inside Leo shifted. The fear he had tasted earlier did not vanish, but it transformed. You're alive, and I'll never lose you again, he murmured quietly, as his gaze sharpened and a colder resolve settled behind it. He had come too close to losing everything. Too close to becoming helpless. And as that realization settled fully within him, he understood one truth with absolute clarity. No matter what stood before him in the future, even if death itself came knocking at his door, he would rather face oblivion head-on than ever endure that kind of emotional devastation again. He had always known just how important his family was for him. However, it was only today, when he momentarily lost them, that he realized just how precious they really were to him. Never again, no matter what. Meanwhile Morris's paw, planet Granada. Thunder. Rainfall. Rain lashed mercilessly against the lone rock that pierced through Granada's endless ocean, as thunder rolled across the black sky while waves crashed violently below. Morris stood barefoot atop the slick stone, bare-chested as always, rain streaming down the sharp planes of his body while wind whipped his long hair wildly around his face. In his hand, the report trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the force of the storm battering it. The 5 great clans seemed to have reached an agreement, where they had formally acknowledged the eternal sovereign Caleth as their nominal leader, and had re-established the old universal order. The old trade routes, the old book of law, the old army structure, they were all restored, in what seemed to be an attempt by the great clans to restore stability across the universe. As reading the report, Morris could not help but smile faintly. So, the sheep gather beneath the wolf's shadow, because they fear the mountain lion, he mumbled, as lightning flashed in the sky above, illuminating his eyes in stark white. His attack on Ruvasa had most definitely forced this change, as fear seemed to have accomplished what politics never could. Oh, how exhilarating, Morris muttered while tilting his head back slightly as rain struck his face. The power the origin blade grants me, it is intoxicating. His fingers twitched faintly, recalling the sensation of divine flesh parting. I wonder how well they sleep now. He let out a soft, uneven chuckle. Vasa most of all. He imagined her waking in the dark. Imagining footsteps. Imagining a blade at her throat. She will lose sleep, lose peace, lose temper. Another thunderclap shook the sky. For centuries perhaps, he lowered his gaze toward the raging ocean below. The universal government had not reformed because of stability. It had reformed because of him. Because one unpredictable variable had torn through their illusion of security. The era of chaos that had begun with Soren's death had not yet stabilized. If anything, it had only grown more unpredictable. More, he whispered. I want more. Rainwater ran down his chest in cold streams as he spread his arms. Slightly, as though embracing the storm. For now, I am the hunted. A slow grin stretched across his face. And I enjoy it. The idea of being pursued made his pulse quicken. Will they unite and march on Granada? He glanced around at the endless ocean. At the single rock. There is nowhere to hide here. He laughed softly. Will they attempt another ambush? Another clever trap. He tore the report cleanly in half and let the pieces blow into the ocean. I hope so. His breathing deepened, uneven, excited. He had not attacked Vasa for territory. Nor for dominance. Nor even for vengeance. He had done it for this. For instability. For the knowledge that the strongest beings alive now felt unsafe in their own realms. Kaboom. Lightning split the sky again. Run to Caliph. Unite. Strengthen your order. His voice rose slightly, almost tender. Because I am not finished. The storm roared around him as he began to laugh openly, the sound nearly swallowed by thunder. The universe had begun to move because of him. And that realization thrilled him more than any victory ever could. Chaos was not a side effect. It was the goal. And Morris had never felt more alive. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.